good. Yeah, they are. Classic Mike harassment joke.
Oh, God. I don't know what I'm burping, but it's happening. A joke so nice you hear it twice.
I know. That's good. Oh, and your burp, too. A little bit of reverb on it all. Nothing better than hearing yourself to start a show.
Burping, I might mind you.
I don't know how people hear this in their headphones throughout an entire show. Like, I would just be driven insane.
Oh my God. Just hearing my voice in general is fucking terrible.
I mean, I agree. It's fun rehearing my sick burn that I got in there.
Is it?
Okay. Cool. What is up, guys? It is time for a deeper dive in today's NBA playoff slate. 4 games before you, and today is a day where they are bringing out the big guns bright and early, and that includes me, Chris Spags, but more so refers to my co-host, a man that I have not been alongside for a while, a man that you have seen on his process videos on the NBA Strategy Show, a man who is well prepared for this moment. He's Josh Engleman. How you doing, Josh?
I'm going to be a lot better when Chris figures out how to stop playing this show in the background in our ears, because it sounds absolutely awful. There it is. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. Oh, boy, that was not going to be fun. I'm good, man. We've got actual playoff basketball here. This silly play and nonsense is done. So we're going to get what we should get: normal rotations and good players playing more minutes and just generally speaking, better basketball. So I'm very happy.
Speaking of, I guess one question I would have for you to kind of lead this off, and I think where you're talking about there with the rotations, it's something where people maybe have gotten spoiled over the last few games being, do or die play-in games. But just a quick note about, I guess, the playoff approach overall before we get to some of the reads and, of course, going game by game here. The rotations in the earlier parts of the playoff series, I guess would be the way Series I would be. The way, yeah, that's either way it was wrong, I think, regardless.
Yep.
For the most part, like, they are going to be not quite the same as the play-in game, where guys aren't going to be playing, 40, 45 minutes necessarily in the early parts of a 7-game series, or, I guess, that to me is the main thing that I would point out. But Josh, give me your thoughts on, I guess, any other changes like rotations you're talking about. But if you have thoughts on rotations, or just anything else that's different between the play-ins and the playoffs themselves, because I think there is going to be a little bit of a learning curve.
Yeah. So it's just like, think about the most important games you have in the regular season. The rotations are going to look like that, but you're probably going to get 1 or 2 less guys overall playing, and you're going to get 2, 4, potentially 6 more minutes to the best players of a game. So if you're normally projecting, say, Jimmy Butler for 36 minutes, the ceiling on those minutes now are probably like 40 if it's competitive. And that, as the series goes on, those numbers expand. If there was a guy that normally got like 10 minutes as 2 rotations, quick stuff at the end of the first and second quarter, maybe at the end of the third, that guy might just not play anymore. He could, but he might not. So it trims the amount of people and it expands the amount of minutes that the stars can play. It's better. It's just better.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, too, some things to keep in mind, kind of like we saw yesterday with Jaren Jackson, where, the matchups are also going to dictate things for parts of the series, where some guys can get played off the floor. Some guys can pick up momentum and earn themselves more minutes and sort of see that stabilize over the course of games. But definitely by the time you get to game 5, game 6, game 7, any games where teams were down 3-0, 3-1, you do see more of that do or die approach. So something just to keep in mind for your overall approach to all of your data. And of course, the best way to get more data into your life right now is to go to awesemo.com/join and check out the the packages that we have going for the season right now. And probably the best one you're going to get right now is an Awesemo Plus weekly pass for $29.95. That includes full access to all the premium projections, ownership projections, premium Slack channel, lineup builder, and much more. And there's also, if you're only looking to play NBA DFS for the playoffs, you get $16.95 for an Awesemo Plus NBA weekly full package, or $4.95 for the weekly express package. Some of the promo codes we had going have expired, so you're paying full freight right now, but still a good deal for the NBA playoffs because that data does go on, and there's a lot going on both in terms of these big slates for now, or bigger slates for now, as well as the showdowns every single day. So make sure to go check all that out at awesemo.com/join. And this show is also brought to you by OddsShopper. A good place to go checking, really starting anything you're doing for sports betting as the beginning of your process is OddsShopper.com or OddsShopper.awesemo.com. You get all the player prop information on there. For NBA in particular, there have been people we promoted on the shows, but I think we maybe didn't do a good enough job talking about on OddsShopper how many people made a killing off of the win percentage and ROI percentage tools at OddsShopper this year. And it's something that, is not quite there, I think, for MLB and some of the other sports, but for NBA, it is still there for you to have those numbers. So go check those out at oddshopper.awesemo.com. If you are a spot where you have legal player prop betting, or if you just, maybe going a little bit under the radar things, that's your choice as an adult. But either way, at oddshopper.awesemo.com, you can find the best lines for all the legal sports books out there and get those win percentage and ROI percentage tools for the NBA. Crucial to your betting process. So go check those out today. Let's get into the game by game though, Josh. And I guess before we go fully game by game, any overarching observations on the slate, anything that you're noticing? I guess one thing I'll throw into the fire right away, studs are priced very well or very cheaply. Value, I don't know where you're going. And I think that's going to make for an interesting construction.
Yeah, there's not a lot of value. If I just sort by some of my general, these guys are the best guys type rankings, it's a lot of 7, 8, 9K type guys. Takes a while till you get to someone like Robert Williams, who's under 5K, but also a gigantic question mark. There isn't a lot of value out here. It lends you to a more balanced build, or you're just going to cross your fingers and hope that you get the value guy correct, which is possible, but I don't really want to hitch my wagon to, Austin Rivers or any other generic dudes that are going to be cheap today. It's scary. It's hard. That's better.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun playing your Paul Millsaps today, but we'll get to that. We're going to go game by game and start it off with the first game on the slate, Miami going into a matchup with Milwaukee. 111 implied points for Miami, and Jimmy Butler going to be a chalk play on Draftkings and Fanduel today. Very nice projection for him, a price point that is so much lower than where he was all season long. Bam Adebayo mostly priced where he was all year long, so I think that's one that's still going to be a really decent option, but one that doesn't quite jump out as much as Butler. But let's start with Butler, Josh, because he's going to be chalky, but he has also been fantastic this year, where I think getting the assist rate up, the usage for him is sort of stabilized at a higher level than it's been in some previous years. And for the most part with Butler, just the 1.36 fantasy points per minute on the year. In the playoffs, you expect him to play even more run and have even more secure run, and certainly even more secure motivation and effort. I feel like Butler is a really difficult player to fade on a slate where he is going to be also very egregious chalk.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I don't have a ton to say about Jimmy Butler. 8,800 on FanDuel, 8,400 on DraftKings. He's, to me, pretty clearly the best option from Miami, and he's getting the ownership that I think he deserves. I don't have much of a take. I think he should be 25 to 30% owned, and that's exactly where he's coming in. Now, I do think it's possible that we don't see Jimmy Butler immediately get into the 38 to 40 minute range for game one of the playoffs. So I have him in for 36 right now, which probably mutes him slightly, but I don't really have much else to say there. He just looks great. Bam for 7,900 on FanDuel, I thought would look a little bit better for me personally. I do generally agree with the 20% ownership that he's getting. Looks fine for 8,300 on DraftKings. It's the rest of Miami that I'm a little curious about. Duncan Robinson is projected for 19% ownership on DK right now. I'm not entirely sure I understand how or why that's happening. That seems really aggressive for someone of his ilk. We've got multiple guys on FanDuel in the 10 to 15% range that I'm just not sure. $5,100 Kendrick Nunn, I don't want him in 15% of my lineups. I don't know how much he even plays today. I got him in for 25 minutes, but I think that there is significant downside in those minutes as well. They're going to prioritize Dragic. I assume they have in the past, kind of fits the playoff narrative a little bit better. So I think Miami as a whole is going a bit overowned. I would rather just stick to the studs.
So I guess speaking of that, and this might be something that changed the most recent run of projections that came in 9 minutes ago because we were starting to do this show, so I didn't pull them in yet. But it does seem like the minutes projections from Awesemo, our Awesemo data team right now, looking pretty lofty for Duncan Robinson. 35.6 minutes projected for him, 29 for Kendrick Nunn, and on the same token, only 19.6 projected for Tyler Hero, which again might be changed right now. So I'm going to pull these in to see if that did change from Awesemo's outlook. But are you surprised by that at all? Because to me, seeing Dragic also at 20 minutes, Hero at 20 minutes, those are the two guys that I would expect get an uptick here and just sort of find their way into whatever rotation exists.
I would be surprised if Kendrick Nunn played more minutes than Goran Dragic in the playoffs here. And I expect Duncan Robinson to play slightly less than that and Tyler Hero to play slightly more than that. To me, all of those things should be like sort of, I don't want to say flip-flop because there are clearly scenarios where all of those things happen. It's not crazy to me, but I don't think that Duncan Robinson and Tyler Hero should be separated by 14 minutes for that game. That just seems a little high. Yeah. And I'm not entirely sure that Nunn is the priority over Dragic. Look, it's game one of the playoff series, and this is where everything changes. And Spo notoriously doesn't pull punches here. He dives into game one with exactly what he wants to do. We saw Myers Leonard start pretty much the entire season last year. Game one of the playoffs, what did they do? Leonard out, not even a part of the rotation any longer. Bam Adebayo into the center spot. They didn't even bat an eye. So they're not going to be waiting to see what kind of adjustments are coming out of Milwaukee. Spo's one of the best coaches on the planet. He's going with whatever's best. And to me, that's going to be more minutes for Dragic over Kendrick Nunn in that spot. The Hero, Duncan Robinson stuff is just sort of like a question mark to me because Hero's been, better lately, but bad most of the year.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think Kendrick Nunn, there's sort of a rep that he's gotten is that he's like a much better defender this year. And I think he's been improved in a variety of ways, but I don't see how they would play him over Dragic. Dragic, a much more steady hand, a guy who can get his shot a little more easily and certainly more reliable over the course of time. And maybe things have flipped around enough during the regular season that could be different. It's worth pointing out too, in this run of projection and minutes that Awesemo just put out right now that I was referencing there, did give an uptick to Tyler Hero, 22 minutes now, or 22 and a half minutes for Tyler Hero, just under 22 for Goran Dragic, but still a lean towards Kendrick Nunn. And a lot going to Duncan Robinson still. So this could be a key part today. I'm sure some of the similar minutes projections out there, if you are seeing that elsewhere, probably going to put people on these guys a little more. And maybe that's one way you get different on the slate. Talk to me about Bam Adebayo a little bit more here because he's still a center play where we do have some really obvious high quality center plays that you can go to. And on DraftKings, you can go to Giannis at center as well. But we do have Bam Adebayo, a guy who's shown pretty big upside, has been out, played a good amount of minutes historically against Milwaukee just to provide the defense that they need to somehow try to stem the blood flow that Giannis can provide. But how are you handling Bam Adebayo today? To me, he looks under-owned. If you're going to have Butler that highly owned, Bam, I think, plays a similar allotment of minutes.
I think he's about right today. I see these scenarios where Bam probably has to do a little bit more defensively in this series than he normally does just because of Giannis. And in those sorts of spots, I assume that he has to take a little bit off on the offensive side. It's just going to be a bigger priority defensively for Bam because Giannis is clearly a problem. So, he's projected for north of 40 fantasy points. He's like a 1.2 fantasy point per minute guy. All of that stuff seems pretty correct. 15% ownership on DraftKings, 20% on Fanduel. I've got no qualms with either of those studs in this spot.
Any value you guys are into here? I know I was listening to, I think it was a low post this week. They were talking about the historical effect that Jay Crowder brought to Miami against Milwaukee in particular, him adding a little more 3-point shooting. They sort of speculated that Trevor Ariza could be a guy who gets more usage, though. Honestly, I'm surprised his price tag didn't come down a little bit for the playoffs, but any interest in him or any of the other peripheral pieces and Iguodala at basically the minimum on DraftKings, any of these guys jumping out to you as being worthwhile?
So I do like Ariza, more so on FanDuel than on DraftKings, but I do like him on DK. Ariza actually is the guy that's grading out with the second best optimal odds for me. 4,300 on FanDuel. We got him projected for 22% ownership, but he's the kind of value play that I think is going to play. He's one of the few guys that I'm pretty confident will play north of 30 minutes today. So I like him on FanDuel. I don't mind the ownership on DraftKings. I am over the field on Ariza on both sites.
All right, let's go to Milwaukee's side. We got Giannis Antetokounmpo, again, looking a little bit cheap for what should be a more secure run of minutes than he saw at points in the regular season. Chris Middleton, Drew Holiday feel like mostly appropriately priced, though on FanDuel. I think you can make the arguments a little bit more there. Same for Dante DiVincenzo, but it does seem like Giannis is a priority here, Josh. But tell me how you're handling it. And I guess also for the sake of everybody out there, I know you mentioned that you're playing a little more for the showdowns on DK, but I presume you're going back to for FanDuel mostly today for the big slate.
I will be playing absolutely no DFS today because I'm going to hang out in Myrtle Beach when this show is over, but that's neither here nor there. But I will talk about all of it. I have all of my data prepped and ready to go. I have Giannis as my second best pay up option today, but behind Jokic. So spoiler alert for that one when we get to the 10:30 game. 1.6 fantasy points per minute. He's the best fantasy point per minute guy on the planet. I'm never going to talk anybody out of going to Giannis. I've got him in for 35 minutes, same as Drew, same as Middleton. And I think most of those guys look sort of similar. I don't really like Chris Middleton today on DK at 8,100. I think he's mildly overpriced. I do like that we're getting the battle of Chris Middleton versus Jimmy Butler, which is really fitting for my brand. Go Chris Middleton in that one. Although I did put Jimmy Butler on my first team all NBA, so maybe I'm changing a little bit. Guy that I think that's getting slept on a little bit here, $4,500 Brook Lopez. I'm interested there if he's only going to be 11% owned. I think that's a spot where you can grab a little bit of value and hope that today is kind of a Brook Lopez game. We established at the beginning, it's pretty hard to find stuff under 5K that looks okay. I'll take my chances on Brook Lopez at relatively low ownership for the slate.
I think that makes some sense. And I like you pointing out your all NBA votes. Like, A, kind of sound like you're presenting it as though you had one in the first place. But B, I will throw out there that I think it was funny that you did the full, like putting it on Excel, making it look formalized on a year where the NBA is making their NBA bet products, starting to get more digital betting components in the mix. I feel like you're positioning yourself to be a part of the all NBA betting first team voting.
Yeah, they should absolutely include me with a first team vote. I clearly put all of my personal biases aside and went with Jimmy Butler in my first team. Anybody that's been watching this show for, 18 months has known that I had a slightly different opinion. He had an exceptional season, and I rewarded him as such.
I respect that as much as I do your Rudy Gobert for MVP take. I feel like was an interesting one, but I saw the logic. I appreciate the fact. Yeah.
John Hollinger had him second. It made me feel a lot better.
So you're saying basically you're up to be the next GM of the Memphis Grizzlies, I guess, which honestly not a bad job to get right now.
I would be happy to work for the Memphis Grizzlies.
I agree. After John Morant yesterday too, I'm happy for John Morant. I guess, do you have any quick thoughts on that? I feel like I know you probably have something you need to get off your chest with that game, but I thought it was fun. And I do feel like Ja's floater game, maybe an interesting little wrinkle to bring to that Utah series.
Didn't watch it, didn't care, didn't matter who won the game. I'm happy that I preferred the Grizzlies winning just because I wanted them to get a little bit of playoff run for such a young team, but I don't care who the 8th seed in the West is.
I think they made a good job making a thing that normally would be like minutia for trivia, other than I guess when your Denver Nuggets upset the Supersonics, which I remember from my childhood. Besides that, though, like I think it was a fun way to make this happen, and maybe less fun now that Steph won't be in the playoffs. But I will happily take part in those again, even though again this play-in tournament has been one of the least successful financially things I've done DFS wise in a while.
I've rallied against it from the beginning. I hated it. I don't need to belabor the point any longer.
Yeah, let's keep going to the next game then. And guys, actually, Josh, I have you here, so I might as well use you for something. Give the people your reasons why they should hit the like button right now on this deeper dive where we've already covered one of the big games up top.
So guys, I'm not normally on a show on Saturday. I'm doing this out of the kindness of my heart. And if I'm being perfectly honest, I'm doing this because Liverpool plays tomorrow and I didn't want to do a show while I would potentially be watching soccer. So with that said, since I'm here on this special Saturday and we've got roughly 900 people here, I think it would be really cool if you guys hit the like button the same way that you normally do when you're watching the Process Show, which airs 6:30 a.m. Eastern time, Monday through Friday. You guys are usually pretty good. We get like a 50% ratio of likes to live viewers. That's pretty sweet. I don't know if we're going to get up to 400 plus while there's 800 people in here, but I think we should give it a damn good shot. So let's at least run that number north of 200. Hit that thumbs up. It helps us out a ton. And then subscribe to the channel because that allows us to bring you more content.
Yeah, our guy, producer Chris, who's responsible for a lot of the scheduling and stuff behind the scenes. We're making sure everything runs the right way. Pointing out, we're also 45 subs away from hitting 55,000. So if you guys are fans, if you're a young Darren Rovell out there who's a fan of useless numerology, hit that subscribe button right now because you have a chance to be number 55,000. And obviously that is something you can put on your resume that, wow, I subscribed to a YouTube channel and they somehow hit a milestone. And I think that's as noteworthy an accomplishment as anything I've done in my career for sure. Next game up, we got Dallas getting 106.3 implied points going against the Clippers. And this series overall, this is one where I mentioned on the tip-off shows a lot throughout the week that I do like the idea of picking Dallas to win the series overall. I think the Clippers are getting treated like they have been crowned as champions and really all the odds and betting, and everybody's approached them this year. And ownership-wise, going to be the case as well, where you have very chalky Kawhi and Paul George on Draftkings in particular. But let's talk about the Dallas side first, Josh, because the thing that stands out to me is that Luka's certainly not a DVP thing, but just has had a lot of success against the Clippers historically. And also in the playoffs, you got to expect he's going to take even more possessions, play a ton of minutes. Luka at under 20% ownership on DK, even at under 30 on FanDuel, low ownership for a guy who does seem to be like, has as good a chance of any for this to be his playoffs and a chance for him to put a stamp on sort of what his upcoming, future, his legacy will be.
I'm really nervous for this spot. I do like the idea of getting to him because of the ownership, but he did not grade out well for me in either of my sims. I like him a bit more on FanDuel, where you're forced to roster 2 point guards on a 4-game slate. It makes it a little bit easier. You're just going to naturally get to some of those guys. But on DraftKings, he is not a priority for me. I actually have him close to half the odds of being in the optimal as he is getting that ownership. I have him behind Jokic, clearly. I have him behind Giannis. I actually have him behind Jason Tatum on DraftKings for today. I don't find Luka to be all that interesting. I actually hate Dallas in this one from a DK perspective. The only guy that I'm interested in at all is Jalen Brunson at 4,100, and he could just as easily not play the 24 minutes that I gave him. He's one of the guys on Dallas that's the biggest question mark. He can play 18 minutes or 30. I never really feel like I have the vibe of what he's going to be doing, but he's the kind of guy that I would want to take a shot on. After that, ownership is really kind of showing the same thing. Other than Luka at 15, these guys are all wrapped around that 10% number. I guess that's where I'm at. So to me, Dallas doesn't look very good. Clippers are a really solid defensive team. 218 total is the lowest on the slate. I'm much more likely to get to Dallas on FanDuel than DK, and that's just a lineup construction thing.
It also should be a low pace game. I mean, both teams playing under a 100 pace, which is kind of surprising to see in this modern NBA. But I think to me, that does sort of make Dallas an interesting tournament team. Like Luka, I think the case is there. I've never really been a big Porzingis guy at any point this year, I guess, other than maybe some of the games when Luka was out. But I do think him on single digit ownership projected at a price tag where he's just not going to come up a lot in an optimizer on DK. I sort of see the logic in going to him. I do think you're paying a price tag for the other guys like Tim Hardaway Jr. You're basically paying for what he did down the stretch in a lot of games without Kristaps Porzingis in the mix. But I think to me, if you get a tournament flyer from Dallas in this spot, I think that's sort of one team here where there's really not a lot of ownership going there. They don't grade out fantastically on paper, but I guess besides Luka, and even then he's going to be behind all the other studs. I think to me, Dallas is sort of the tournament option team that I'd want to go to. I guess a question for you, Josh, the big man situation, is there anybody who stands out here? Dwight Powell kind of played well down the home stretch where it does seem like maybe you could pick up more playoff minutes, but would you go to any of Dwight Powell, Kleber, Willie Cauley-Stein? All these guys are cheap enough and couldn't be value on a slate that's desperately in need of it.
Just to mention it, by the way, Clippers second slowest team in my pace metric in the league, Dallas fourth slowest. So yeah, this is quite the pace down spot just in general. I don't really have all that much interest in the big men. On FanDuel, I think that KP, Luka, and Dorian Finney-Smith are the guys that I'm looking to get to most. DFS is only 4K. I assume he's going to be out there a lot, just kind of grabbing whatever he can on Paul George or Kawhi Leonard. I think his minutes are the most secure. So I like getting him if you're looking for value. He's not a good fantasy player at all. I've got him projected for 0.63 fantasy points per minute today. Just spoiler alert, that sucks. At the same time, though, I'm in for the minutes. I don't know. No interest in Dwight Powell. No interest in Willie Cauley-Stein. Would I be surprised if Willie Cauley-Stein ended up having to play more today and was a good per minute guy at the flat minimum? No, not at all. But I think that's like a 2% outcome. So I can't really advocate for it too hard.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think to me, these are guys, if you're getting some sprinklings of them and a full tournament exposure, a full grouping of lineup exposure, I think that seems fine. And I think a decent spot to be. But yeah, none of these guys would be core players, I think, to me, maybe besides Luka, if you can get there. Let's talk about the Clippers side, though. I guess two guys, or one guy in particular, who on DraftKings may make it tougher to get to Luka, is that Kawhi Leonard just grades out really well today, going to be very highly owned on DraftKings, a little bit less highly owned on FanDuel. Paul George, the inverse, going to, I guess not even the inverse, also going to be highly owned on DraftKings, but even higher owned on FanDuel. And these two guys, Josh, on the year basically have played roughly the same, a 1.32 fantasy point per minute number for Kawhi on the year, 1.27 for Paul George on the year. Both guys too cheap in this spot as well, especially if Dallas does keep it competitive. So Paul George and Kawhi seem like core plays no matter what site you're playing on today. But I guess, do you have a lean towards either, Josh, or is there anything you're doing to handle them?
So I prefer Paul George on FanDuel, and I prefer Kawhi Leonard on DraftKings, but they're both high-end plays today, especially on DK. I mean, those prices are just wrong. Paul George for 7,800. That is I'd say it's a slap in the face, but we'll see what we get out of playoff P here. He has been slightly bad. However, they are clearly unquestionably the top two plays on the Clippers, two of the best plays on the slate. The ownership is fully warranted. I have nothing else really to add there. Other guys that I'm getting to from the Clippers, Ivica Zubac at 4,600 on DraftKings, Reggie Jackson at 3,800, where that's a spot where we mentioned we don't have a ton of value on this slate. I don't mind paying down for Reggie Jackson. I'm sure people are going to be touching themselves to the thoughts of Rondo doing something good today. I hope you guys will remember that he's not good. Nick Batum, 3,500. If they have him out there a little bit more for defensive reasons, I think that he could fall into a couple extra minutes potentially. He's probably like a 15%er. That's the same sort of way that I see Zubac and Reggie Jackson, somewhere in that 15 to 20% range. But don't be afraid to lock and load Kawhi and Paul George.
Do you see any Ibaka for yourself at all? I feel like he was the one guy that didn't make it into that list of guys, but does project to be playing 23 minutes today from Awesemo. I think they actually have Ibaka and Zubac both projected for around 23 minutes. So they have it pretty close to an even split. But do you see any Ibaka for yourself? I feel like he's one of the guys I think you can maybe make a tournament case for under 10% ownership and decent projection if he does play those minutes.
I'd be surprised if he played those minutes. He basically hasn't played in months. He came back and played 17 minutes and 19 minutes. Like, surely they're going to be ramping him up. Their ultimate success is going to have a lot to do with how many minutes he can play. I have him in for 21 right now. I think the upside in Ibaka isn't a minutes thing. It's just that he goes crazy. And on a day like today, I prefer getting to guys that I think actually have a bigger minutes ceiling. And I don't really see a scenario where Serge Ibaka is playing significantly bigger minutes today.
Also, people in the YouTube chat seemingly rebuffing or giving their own additions to your take on Rondo. And Rondo today projected by Awesemo to only play 9 minutes, but I do feel like we have to talk about him maybe for a second more here because it does seem like the spot we know the playoff Rondo narrative, which I do think is one that could give him more than the next to no ownership that's projected for him today right now, currently from the Awesemo ownership projections. But I have to ask about Rondo here because I agree with you. I don't think he plays meaningful minutes unless there's a spot where the Clippers get in desperation mode. And I don't think game one against Dallas is going to be that spot that stirs that up. But do you want to give any more thoughts on Rondo here? Because people will go that way just based on the playoff Rondo narrative.
Yeah, no, I don't want to give any thoughts on Rondo. He's 35 years old. He's not good. I don't care. I don't care what he did in 2009 for the Celtics in the playoffs. It's not that meaningful for me anymore. He was shockingly decent last year for the Lakers. I don't have anything else to say. I don't expect that to continue in perpetuity. At some point in time, he stops being in the playoffs and ramping it up for the big games. At some point in time, he's just going to be done playing basketball. You can't always think that he's going to be good in the playoffs. I'm willing to start right now.
I also think it's just tougher for him to get to those minutes where he can, be productive and have that upside because you do have Reggie Jackson, you do have Beverly both there sort of taking enough point guard minutes off the table where like Rondo, part of the reason he played well for the Lakers is that he was getting that second unit run initially and was just kind of coming in and doing what he can do, which is be productive, get assists, get some easy buckets for whatever court time he's out there. Like, I just don't know how he gets that court time again, unless the Clippers are getting destroyed and they're like, screw it, let's throw Rondo out there and hope that goes off. And with the spread being what it is, the Clippers favored by 5, low pace game. Like, I just don't see this as a spot where you pull the Rondo switch. Maybe at some point in the playoffs it will be, but I just feel like for game one, I just wouldn't go to Rondo at all.
Nope, not at all. I wouldn't have a single share.
Yeah. So that's me. And I get, people, you guys will have that narrative, people saying Rondo elite, Rondo will play backup point guard minutes, Rondo is on the court. That's the narrative a lot of people will have for themselves today. And I think it's certainly possible that he plays the 10 minutes that Awesemo has been for, I guess the 9 minutes that Awesemo has been for. Maybe that gets to 12 to 14. That's not going to be enough at his price tag. He's not even minimum salary. They're sort of pricing him with whatever people are going to be expecting of Rondo. So just keep that in mind. If you are thinking, oh, hey, it's playoff time, Rondo's going to step up. It doesn't look like there's an obvious pathway to that. And a lot of people will think the same way you do. So it's going to be over-owned for what that potential is. So you're mileage.
Could you imagine looking at this thinking like, oh, it's Rondo. He's the man, bro. Don't you think he would play more? Yeah,
I think he would. I think he's a stabilizing force that they have if everything goes to shit and like Paul George and Kawhi do what they did last year, Paul George in particular kind of wilts, then Rondo will come in and browbeat some people and maybe they can steal one game on his back. But that just doesn't happen in game one to me.
No, I'm sure he's more likely to call a ref a slur than do anything positive today.
Playoff Rondo greater than Curry. All right, people. Now, Pete, you're being redundant. Ramsey Perry saying you're being redundant enough Rondo already. I need to I'm replying to the will of the people, which is talking about Rondo, and I want to make sure we cover this one to give our thoughts on it. Hey, if people out there are right, more power to them. But we're talking about things and also, quite frankly, filling an hour for 4 games. So please, with your producer notes, please leave that to our producer, Chris, who's so much more veteran and seasoned behind the scenes at giving us those. Next game up, Boston, 111.8 implied total, going against Brooklyn, highest total game on the slate, the 231.5 combined points in this one. And Josh, you're getting a Boston team that's going to have Jason Tatum with no Jaylen Brown, a spot that historically on the year has led him to about 1.4 fantasy point per minute production, a 34% usage rate for him. Really, things seem like they are good for Jason Tatum, other than the fact that he is being priced exorbitantly high on both sites today, and does seem like that's driving down the ownership, under 20% on Fanduel, under 15% owned on Draftkings. And it does seem like Tatum, another guy who, as a tournament play, has a lot of interest, but he's competing with some of the heavyweights at his position.
Boston's my favorite team today. I don't understand why they're not getting as much love as they should be. And like some of these guys are, but like what happens if Robert Williams plays 24 minutes today? He's one of the best plays on the slate as far as I'm concerned. And we have him projected for 18% ownership. I'm in. I want a lot of Robert Williams. I want a lot of Kemba Walker. He's 7,800. He's going to play 38 minutes against an absolutely dreadful defense. I love Brooklyn as an offensive team, obviously. James Harden, Kyrie Irving, and Kevin Durant are probably like 3 of the 10 best offensive players on the planet. They're going to score. Their defense sucks. And I don't feel like Boston's getting enough respect in terms of scoring. They're going to miss Jaylen Brown. They're not going to win this series. But from an offensive perspective, there is a lot here. I think Kemba is massively, massively underowned on both sides. I love Jason Tatum today. 10-1 on DraftKings is pretty healthy. Don't mind getting to him, however. I've already mentioned Robert Williams. Marcus Smart, I have in the optimal lineup on FanDuel 53% of the time. We've got him at 35% ownership. He's 5,700. I think that he's going to have a relatively big role trying to guard James Harden and Kyrie Irving. He's going to be out there constantly. I'd even get to a little bit of Evan Fournier if you need to. Tristan Thompson's probably a bit overpriced on DraftKings, but I think that you can make that work on FanDuel if you don't think Robert Williams is the guy. But either way, get more Boston in your life. This is a perfect matchup.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, relative to the slate, we talked about that Clippers-Mavs game, very low pace. This one should be a higher pace relative to the playoffs. And I'm with you. I think Tatum's interesting tournament play. The fact that he's going to be under 15% owned just doesn't make the most sense. I think Giannis is going to be a stronger play for that median outcome. But if this game somehow stays close, it's largely going to be on Jason Tatum's back. And we've seen him have 50 real life point upside in addition to whatever else he does with rebounds and assists. So Tatum to me is the one that I would agree with the most. But Kemba too. Like Kemba's been a 30% usage rate guy on the year without having Jaylen Brown on the court. The assist rate doesn't come up a lot, but still a 1.1 fantasy point per minute guy is what I have projected at today. Like I'm with you. I think all these guys are good. The one that I'd push back on is Marcus Smart. I agree he's going to play a lot of minutes, but he has not been increasingly productive in any situation on the year without Jaylen Brown, which kind of worries me. And I would think he would be, but it seems like maybe he's getting squeezed by having Kemba be a little more assertive for his shots, having Evan Fournier in the mix as well. I guess Smart is the one thing I'd poke a hole in, Josh. And I guess the other thing too is that he did bust his chalk the other day, which I think, maybe that drives the ownership down a little bit more, but you're willing to get above the field on him projected for 40% ownership on FanDuel?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's because of FanDuel. Like, I think he's a relatively neutral play on DraftKings, but 5,700 for Smart, given what I think he's going to play from a minutes perspective, is just different here. Harden at 10-5 is solid, but that team is really tricky from a DFS perspective because they can't all get there. That's going to be really difficult to happen. So I'm a little muted on Harden. Then we get Paul George at 8,400, CJ at 75. The next 3 guys that I think that are viable are Marcus Smart, Tyler Hero, and Dante DiVincenzo. There's just not a lot at shooting guard, and you have to roster 2 of them. So it starts to add up pretty quickly. I only think that there are 6 legitimate options of guys that you could roster at shooting guard today. And I think Marcus Smart makes it work where you're paying down, but you're still getting that minutes upside. And that's allowing you to get better stuff elsewhere. So it's mostly just a function of the position. Not that I don't like him, but I think this matchup and that price fits him perfectly for today at a position that's kind of difficult to fill out.
Also, we got a super chat that I'm going to get to in a second from our guy, Arcathelza. But this is something that I meant to get to earlier just to kind of fill a little bit of time while we're going through all the games. But people talking about your shirt, and Corey Balmer says in particular, is Josh wearing a silk mermaid print shirt? Which I know it's a Hornet shirt. You've worn this shirt many times before. People earlier in the chat knew it was a Hornet shirt. But for the sake of Corey, Josh, are you wearing a silk mermaid print shirt?
No, it's a hive print. It's a Hornets. It's a soccer kit made in. It's the Hornets theme made into a soccer kit.
Classic mermaid silk print. What is a mermaid print? Like, what is? Is that a style?
Idea. Scales, I assume, is the word you're looking for.
Yeah, like I think yes, scales is what it would be. But if you had a mermaid thing on the side, I guess I wouldn't be mad at it. That's there are people who role play that for fun, and I feel like anybody can look at Josh and see the resemblance to Ariel, the Little Mermaid. I think that's really the main thing I would point out. Arcathelza asking Tatum or Joker on a DK single entry. We haven't gotten to Nikola Jokic yet. He's going to be in the last game on the slate that we're going to get to after this one. But I think that for me, it still has to be Jokic just because of everything running through him. This whole series is going to run through him for the most part. But Tatum certainly in play, Josh. So would you want to go Tatum over Nikola Jokic for a DK single entry?
No, I would not.
Yeah. I think the ceiling is certainly there for Tatum, but the floor and the ceiling are there for Jokic in a way that I would find it hard to get away from. The projection is just honestly not that close. Awesemo has it being, it looks like a 57.5 fantasy point projection on DK compared to a 48.1 fantasy point projection for Tatum. So Tatum's still a good play for, according to Awesemo's data, but not quite where that would be. Robert Williams, talk to me a little more about that, because I agree with your take about him. I assume that he starts here, though. Our guy Steven Leibovitz in the chat pointing out the turf toe for Robert Williams clearly has been a reoccurring issue for him, and it's one that we as sort of DFS hosts, really anybody doing any TV or media content out there, I feel like poo-poo turf toe in a way that is not necessarily congruent with the injury itself. But if Williams gets the starting nod, Josh, I think this is one where we need the news for me to confirm my interest in Williams, where if he's starting, I feel a lot safer about it. But just one more thought on Williams for you, and I guess if he's projected for 19 minutes, what do you have him at compared to Awesemo's minutes projection?
I have him in for 24, clean split with Tristan Thompson, because I think that he could actually cause some problems on the offensive side and the defensive side for Boston in this game. Now, there's a lot of downside in Robert Williams. He can get played off the floor because he's flighty. And can we figure out a different name for turf toe when you play basketball?
Court toe. Wood toe?
He got that wood toe. Anyway, it's not important. So the thing about Robert Williams, and the reason that he should be significantly more owned, is the goal is to win a GPP. And if it goes wrong for Robert Williams, like, that's fine. Like, those lineups are going to be dead. They're going to be dead when you get your center wrong, regardless. But when it goes right, we're talking about a guy that's like a 1.3 fantasy point per minute guy. He can win you a slate. Like, there aren't a lot of guys that when the minutes go right, his score becomes the essential score. Robert Williams is one of those guys that can actually break today's slate at sub 20% ownership on a 4-game slate. If he's named starter, and I guess his ownership would likely come up a little bit, I'll like him just as much, if not more. I'll be firmed up in what I think that he can do. And I have him in the optimal north of 30% of the time. To me, this is the type of GPP winning play that you can make today.
Also, I don't mean to harp on this. Mike Diamond saying Josh looks like Michelangelo from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I think it's unfair. That would clearly be Donatello because of the purple.
Yeah, obviously. People think they're making good jokes. They're terrible. God, leave the funny for us.
I enjoy people getting their ribs in, but I just feel like I'm a big guy. As one thing I've always brought to the table, I'm a stickler for Ninja Turtle accuracy. And I do feel like you got to get your colors right when you're going to go with that one. Paula Kesey asking under 4K, who plays 20 minutes? Green, Morris, and Simon. So he is already digging deep. Josh, any he thought on these guys who plays 20 minutes between Green, Morris, and Simons?
Imagine saying Green on a day like today. Like, that's just one person. I assume it's Jeff Green, but is there another Green? Because there probably could be. I think he means Michael would be my guess. Well, exactly. Imagine asking a question where you just give the last name that's as generic as it could be. I have no idea. Come back. Which Morris? I guess there's only one more. No, there's two Morrises today.
Yeah, there are.
I quit with your question.
I think JaMychal Green is projected for over 20 minutes. So assuming that's the way the question's going, Paul, he is projected for over 20, but it's still, you're doing some narrow margin stuff there. Let's talk more about the Brooklyn side of the equation here. We got James Harden going to be priced the most expensive here on DraftKings between the big three. Kevin Durant entirely unowned on FanDuel. Kyrie Irving unowned entirely on DraftKings, and also fairly unowned on FanDuel as well. These guys, for the most part, Josh, not being treated like this, like they're, I guess, relevant parts of the slate. And I guess maybe that could be people not being able to decipher who's going to get the production out of the big three for Brooklyn today. But it does seem like there's certainly some tournament potential here. Harden's median projection to me looks the worst from a value perspective, but certainly the ceiling is there given what we knew all year. So I guess, how are you handling the Brooklyn Nets big three?
I'm very, very anti them, but at the same time, no one's really on them on DraftKings either. They all have like relatively muted usage rates when they're all on the floor with each other. And I think it makes it really difficult to try to prioritize any one of these guys. One of them is probably going to have an exceptional game by default. Whoever gets cooking, they're probably going to let that guy continue to cook. I just don't have any confidence in trying to figure out who that's going to be. I have James Harden grading out as the best play on DK, Kyrie second, Durant third. Same story on FanDuel. But I have most of Brooklyn pretty dramatically overowned. I think Nick Claxton is worth a run at 4,100 on FanDuel, 3,500 on DraftKings. He's the type of guy that can fall into enough minutes to be viable. And then that's probably it. Like $4,400 Blake is probably the best play on DK today, which could you imagine if saying that at the beginning of the season?
Yeah, I would agree. I guess the question I would have for you think he starts, right? Because I think that would be my assumption is that it doesn't seem like we have DeAndre Jordan projected for any minutes. So I guess he is projected to be mostly excised from the rotation at this point. But do you think Blake starts, or are they going to do something weird there at center?
That's a good question. I'm guessing Blake starts. That seems like the more likely scenario. He's just looked like a different guy now that he's been in Brooklyn. Shocking that maybe happiness makes you feel a little bit better compared to playing in Detroit, but that's neither here nor there. Yeah, I'm guessing Blake starts. I have him in for 26 minutes. I gave Claxton almost all of the backup center run, but I think that could change a little bit depending on how the game's going. So yeah, if Blake is starting, and I assume that he is, 4,400 looks pretty good.
All right, and let's talk about the rest of these Nets. Joe Harris, somebody that is projecting as a decent value play. And you mentioned Nick Claxton, another guy who's very cheap and could find his way to earn some minutes in the course of the series. Those two guys, Josh, I guess let's talk about Joe Harris first. Is he somebody that you're willing to get to? I feel like the field on both DraftKings and FanDuel, 15%, 17% on FanDuel. Like, that seems to me to be about right for Joe Harris. Like, I don't expect him to be very productive, but I feel like if you're going to get to him, like, that as a cap is probably more than enough.
Yeah, I don't have a ton of interest. He's not really the most productive guy in the world. I'm just trying to look. Wow, he doesn't even have. I was trying to compare him to Duncan Robinson right now, since they're pretty much the same person, but they've got basically the same ownership. So I don't have anything really to add. Look, it's Joe Harris. If the threes are falling, things will look decent for him. He's a terrible fantasy performer.
Yeah, and he's also going to, I think, see just more possessions go more to Durant, more to Kyrie, more to James Harden as they start to matter more. So Harris, you're sort of banking on him getting hot, and then these guys also underperforming in a way that I wouldn't want to be there a ton, but I do get it. Jeff Green, is he in play for you at all? 3,800. There's a pathway to him starting, I think, or getting meaningful run. I feel like the minutes don't look great for him now. 16 minutes is the projection from Awesemo's data right now, but I feel like Jeff Green's just one guy I would throw into the mix. And Bruce Brown, there have been rumors about him starting in that starting group too. Maybe Joe Harris coming off the bench. I think those are guys that we kind of need to mention on the deeper dive show, because I think there is some pathway for them to get minutes that we just don't know right now. But I'm surprised that both guys are quite this low in terms of minutes from Awesemo.
Yeah, there's certainly minutes upside in Jeff Green, but he's going to need every one of those minutes to be good. He's not the best per minute guy. Bruce Brown as well could be the guy that, like, one of those guys can benefit from these minutes in a bigger way. Like, I don't have DeAndre Jordan in the rotation. Nick Claxton can play a little bit less. Jeff Green can play a little bit more at the 5 potentially. That it could go that way. None of these guys are looking like priorities to me, whether that's Brown or Green or Shamet, I guess.
Yeah, I would agree. I think to me, Bruce Brown is the one that I would just watch out for, because if he somehow sneaks to the starting lineup, given the fact that he was good down the stretch at 4,300 on DK, I think he can sort of make the flyer there, because he's the one who sort of gets whatever overfill is going to be left from James Harden, Durant, or Kyrie, because Bruce Brown is kind of working that entire time to get to the rim to sort of take advantage of whatever they're opening up. So that's one that I would just watch out for. But right now, it does seem like Joe Harris is the option that people will go to the most, and I think that maybe gives these guys more utility. Got the last game on the slate. So guys, hit that like button if you can, and make sure to go check out the packages at awesemo.com/join. We have just no promo codes going right now, but we still have a ton of data going on for the NBA. Obviously, you have the big slates like this one, the showdown slates coming up as well. There are going to be a lot of big ones for those. Some of the main, like the night slates that are going to be going on, including tonight as well, where we have the 2 games coming up later. So lots of data to use for yourself to play a lot of DFS. So that's the main thing that you can get for yourself at awesemo.com/join. Weekly packages, monthly packages, go check them all out on there right now. Let's also actually quick look at the schedule coming up here, because we do have some shows after hours on this particular stream. Right after hours, you'll have Eytan and Greg coming up doing the NBA Live Before Lock show, taking you through their takes on everything, as well as any last minute news that comes out. If there are any weird things like a Bismack Biyombo starting type of situation, they'll take you through everything you need to know there. We also have UFC Live Before Lock, not USC Live Before Lock, which I would support as well, but UFC Live Before Lock doing great for a lot of people with the MMA product this year. That's coming up at 3 p.m. Eastern today. And there's an MLB Live Before Lock show coming up at 6 p.m. Eastern today, with your old pal EMAC coming back again, waking up from his midday nap, I'm sure, to come back and give you guys some great takes on MLB alongside Gundacker. And at 7 p.m. Eastern, another NBA Live Before Lock with Eytan and Terry, taking you through the shorter slate that'll be coming up at the end of the day. So lots of content coming here, lots of Live Before Locks for every sport. So come check them all out, subscribe to the channel to see whenever they go live. Last game on the slate, Portland, 113 implied total. And Josh, Damian Lillard projecting to be, I think, a decent value option, but on a slate where there are so many studs. Talk to me about him first, because he's at a price tag people probably won't get to as much. And we do know from him and his history, his torrid history, that he can certainly ramp it up one more level in the playoffs.
This is the game I like the most. Both sides of it, I think, are going massively, massively under-owned. I'm locking and loading a lot here. Now, I don't say this because I think it's awesome. It's just a position thing. But Robert Covington, 4,600 on Fanduel, 4,900 on Draftkings. I think he's going underrepresented as a potential value option. He's the type of guy that's going to be out there a lot in the playoffs. CJ McCollum showing up in the optimal 40% of the time for me on Fanduel at 7,500. At 7,900 on Draftkings, I think he's going under-owned at 13%. He's the guy that's going to play 38 minutes or more here. Clearly play Dame if you would like, but 9,700 on Fanduel is pretty healthy. 94 on DraftKings. I liked it a lot better when he was sub 8K like 4 weeks ago. Much better time there. And then Norm Powell, he's 6,400 on Fanduel and under 10% owned. To me, that's an interesting contrarian option for the playoffs. He's 5,700 on DraftKings today, only 18% ownership. I would like to get to quite a bit more. I think there's a lot of value. I think a lot of this Portland team is slightly underpriced. I think that they are the best team relative to their current ownership. They're the guys that I want to get to the most. It's just scary because this is the last game on the slate. If you're leaving stuff out there and something pops up, you don't have a lot of options to make changes.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And Norman Powell, people in the chat talking about how he's a play coming up a lot in the optimizer, which I'm surprised to see actually the ownership being this low for Norman Powell, given the fact that really isn't a lot of great value in the mid 4Ks, or definitely not a lot in the 3Ks on DraftKings. But Powell at 5,400 to me looks like the most, or 5,600, excuse me, looks like the most playable option in that range. So to me, 17% ownership. I wouldn't be shocked if the runs of ownership closer to lock if that comes up a little bit. But I agree, the run should be secure. We have him projected for healthy amount of minutes today. Actually have him projected for 38 minutes from Awesemo today, which feels kind of lofty, but still definitely some amount of secure run for Norman Powell. I think he is one of the better mid-tier option plays on DraftKings in particular. Talk to me about Robert Covington. I feel like he's one guy that you didn't mention in your grouping there, but he's somebody that does pop up a lot for me throughout the year. And I think in the playoffs, he is one of those guys that I would expect just kind of gets more minutes for the defense. And maybe this Denver grouping doesn't need a Covington quite as much as some other ones they'll face in the playoffs potentially. But I feel like Covington, just another dude I've thrown in the mix, 13% owned on DraftKings, 19% on FanDuel. I think he could do enough to work in an optimal lineup construction.
I love that you are channeling your inner Laffy since you are hosting the deeper dive, because Covington was the guy that I led with for Portland.
Oh, was it? God, I was so excited about your other takes, but damn it, I missed Covington completely in that. It's funny because I do pay attention. I do listen for the most part, but damn it, I guess the Laffy got me, the spirit of Laffy.
There you go, Lofty. That one's for you. Just know that your shoes are filled perfectly. No one listens while I speak. And that's how you miss out on everything. No, so I like Covington more on FanDuel than I do on DraftKings, but I like him pretty aggressively on both. Nurkic, Lillard, Powell, McCollum, Covington, and Carmelo Anthony, to me, on both sites, FanDuel and DraftKings, are all either correctly owned or under-owned. No one shows up below my neutral spot. I love all things Portland today.
One guy who we got that super chat about before, Anthony Simons, who was asked about if he's going to play over 20 minutes. Projection in minutes for him is 16 today from Awesemo, but Simons is a guy I feel like we just have to touch on quickly because he's cheap enough that I could see people putting him into lineups. Actually projected for over 6% or a little bit under 6% ownership actually on DraftKings and 4% on FanDuel. I feel like Simons is one of those guys where I think he'll get a few minutes here, but he's a guy to me with Powell getting more minutes, with McCollum and Lillard getting more minutes. I feel like he's mostly going to be excised from the rotation at this point, Josh. I don't know if you have any thoughts on Simons in particular, but I just wouldn't play him a lot as a value play. And I think people maybe get tempted there because there's nobody else in rotations who are playable at 3,100.
I wouldn't play him at all.
Yeah, I agree. Any Enos Cancer for you at all? I feel like I just have to sort of mention he's been productive per minute. Maybe there's some way off the bench he gets things going against JaMychal Green, or I guess if JaVale somehow sneaks into a playoff rotation. I don't know if that's going to be the case, but would you get to any Cancer at all?
No, I think if Portland wants to win this game, they're going to need as much out of Nurkic as possible. There's probably going to be a game where Nurk gets into foul trouble and Cantor can be pretty solid off the bench, but I don't feel like game one is that game.
Also, Larry C pointing out, I was reading the chat. That's why I see Lofty's line. That actually was true. I was looking at the chat, but I still usually can do both. And I just, Robert Covington, I guess, slipped through the cracks. But certainly the fact he got mentioned twice independently, lock him in, I think would be the thing that I would do on this slate.
I agree.
Denver, 114 implied points for them. Nikola Jokic, one of the chalkier plays on the slate, but still to me, given the fact that this isn't a Joel Embiid slate, I guess it is on DraftKings slate where you could put Giannis at center. So that's the one thing I think you can sort of shortchange Jokic for, but he is a center play I would want to go to here in the playoffs. Like, I know he sort of has historically butted heads with Nurkic or had some tougher times with Nurkic's defense, but I just feel like his game has evolved enough where I don't expect that to be anything that's going to be an inhibitor for what he does. And Jokic at his price tag, I think as good as any play on the slate. I think for tournament options, you could certainly go to the Lukas, the other directions we talked about, where you have a cheaper Kawhi, cheaper Paul George, and all that. But for center, Josh, I feel like Jokic would be just one play for a lineup construction that, unless you're playing like Robert Williams and getting cheap and hoping that he can sort of spike a big upside, I just don't know how you don't play Jokic.
Yeah, to me, he's the best play on the slate today. I don't have much to add. The ownership is already there. You should play Jokic. I think the most important thing to talk about for Denver is the rest of these guys, who I think are probably even more under-owned than Portland. Michael Porter Jr. is 7,500 on FanDuel. I have him in the optimal 48% of the time. I think he plays 38 minutes. We've got him projected for 26% ownership. I want all the MPJ. I like him quite a bit. Double the field on DraftKings as well at 8,200. Aaron Gordon is 4,800 and 5K on FanDuel and DraftKings respectively. I would like to double the field in his ownership on DraftKings, where he's only 17% owned. Facundo Campazzo at 5,400 and 5,200 across both sites, I think is under owned. And then the biggie, which isn't really fun to think about, but as of right now, if Austin Rivers is in single digits in ownership at 4,200 on DraftKings, I am going to advocate for playing more Austin Rivers. I have him in the optimal about 20% of the time. I think that because the lack of value that's out there, I think he's going to play north of 30 minutes. That's the type of guy that I want to take my shot on. This game should be competitive. I think he plays the whole way through. I really like locking and loading Porter, Jokic, Gordon, Campazzo, Rivers. I like that same sort of stuff on Portland. To me, this is the most important game on the slate.
Will Barton he's not going to play. Okay. So I know there were some reports out there that he's going to try to play for the opener, but he's not playing. So never mind that one. But you mentioned Aaron Gordon, and I guess the one question I would have for you about him is he was less productive in Denver than I would have thought was ever possible. And I think that some of that does coincide with Michael Porter Jr. sort of stepping up more and being one of the best shooters in the league, and really from 3-point in particular, but just in general. But Aaron Gordon, do you think he goes up a level here? Because the rates for him on the year are not that good, but he is a guy that I feel like the crush of minutes combined with him maybe getting a little bit more in the way of responsibilities depending on matchups. Like, it feels like he should be over a fantasy point per minute guy, but he's only been at 0.96 this year.
Yeah, 0.78 over the last 30 days as well. He's been truly terrible, but I just don't care on a day like today. Minutes are more important to me than previous rates. And we've seen him be close to a fantasy point per minute guy in the past. I don't know if that happens right away in game one, but I'm willing to bet on the playing time. Maybe as the series goes on, we see him open up a little bit more offensively, but I'm still willing to take those chances at 5K. But I do agree. He's not the same guy that he was in Orlando.
And Paul Millsap, JaMychal Green, two value plays that I know you were reluctant to get to earlier, but they are going to jump out, I think, from a median projection standpoint. Millsap projected for 20% ownership on DraftKings, 14% on Fanduel. JaMychal Green projected for 15% on DraftKings, 9% on Fanduel. Are these guys you would get at all in your lineups? It does feel like maybe there's a pathway for Millsap to play a few more minutes in this game where, I don't know, like they could need his stabilizing presence, I guess. And defensively, he's probably not going to kill him. But do you see any life for either guy in your lineups?
If Paul Millsap's 21% owned, you should have 0 of Paul Millsap. To me, that's nuts. You need a very specific outcome for Paul Millsap to beat the 20% ownership that he's getting right now. I don't really see that. They have multiple different directions they can go at the 5. They can throw JaVale out there. They can go smaller and have JaMychal Green out there. It doesn't have to be Paul Millsap. He's going to need every one of those minutes. Even at 3,600, I'm not sure that I agree with that ownership play right there. Monty Morris, I don't know. I see Morris, Harrison, Millsap, Green as guys that are actually pretty massively over-owned. That's not the spot that I'm looking to get value. If they're already getting that ownership, you need to be right twice. They need to be good and get the playing time. And to me, that's kind of scary today.
Who do you think closes for Denver? Because I feel like it would be Jokic, Porter, Jr., Gordon, Campazzo, and then question mark. And it does seem like Austin Rivers has been getting more of the run with Morris missing some time, but I feel like it has to be one of Morris or Rivers, but I guess it could be Millsap or Green too who would close.
Let's think about it from a Portland standpoint. Lillard, McCollum, Powell, Covington, Nurkic is the likely closing lineup there, correct? I don't know. Yeah, maybe Melo pushes his way into that because he's Melo. I don't know. So from a defensive standpoint, like, I don't expect this to happen, but to go to Millsap or Green doesn't really fit that kind of matchup. They don't need that guy at the 4 to provide that. Like, so someone like Shaq Harrison, oddly enough, to bring him in from a defensive standpoint to get onto someone like CJ McCollum at the end could be a direction that they go matchup specific. It's probably one of Millsap or Green, but I think they're probably just grabbing the hot hand as well. The 5th guy could really go either direction. The first 4 that you mentioned are pretty much set in stone.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page then. So it's definitely a role here where I think I wouldn't take 0% of Millsap on DraftKings. I think for that reason, I think there's a pathway for him to be the guy who just kind of stands next to Covington on some possessions potentially, but definitely one to keep in mind and then one that's going to have some volatility. Any final thoughts, Josh? Any final plugs? I guess, where are you going to be appearing today in Myrtle Beach?
I have no idea. An arcade, a bar, all over the place. I just need to get out for a little bit. Now that the shackles are off of the United States, I'm going to have some fun today.
I once went to I might have told you the story before, but I once went to a bachelor party in Myrtle Beach, and we were out the whatever that is, the Broadway thing where there's a bunch of things together, and somebody got shot accidentally at a Senior Frogs because the person was showing off their gun, and I guess the bullet like ricocheted and hit somebody in the thigh. And we were about to go there, and there were police outside. We're like, oh, these cops, like such assholes, are wearing shields and whatever. It's like, nope, somebody just legitimately got shot in this place.
Yeah, that's Myrtle Beach for you.
That is, in fact, Myrtle Beach for you. Make sure to go follow at Josh Engleman, follow at Chris Spags. Stay tuned on this link as well. Live Before Lock coming up next with Eytan and Greg. They're going to take you into the home stretch and tune in all day long for all the Live Before Locks across a bunch of different sports, including one more coming up for NBA as well. We appreciate you guys. Wish you the best of luck this weekend. Enjoy. Good luck.
Feel good about the Sixers' chances?
I hope against Washington. But yes, I do. I think there's something sneaky wrong with Embiid's.
Did I freeze or did something else happen?
Did something else happen? Yeah, because I heard it too.
Are we
Chris?
still good? Oh, we're going to find out now. Okay, cool.
It's
All right,
like
awesome.
an echo though, right? Do you hear that? Okay.
That's okay. Yeah. All right, that's what it is. No, it's cool.
All good, brother.
Yeah.
All good. All right. Welcome. We've got a busy night for you. It continues here in the NBA as the playoffs are playoffs, not play in, are finally upon us. We've got 4 games. One tips off at 2:00 Eastern. So we're going to get you ready. Specifically, of course, Greg Ehrenberg, at G Ehrenberg on Twitter, myself at Shander Show, and typically live before lock. A lot of this, as we'll remind you throughout, is you interacting with you on the super chat, interacting with you on the premium Slack. So all the Awesemo Plus members want to take full advantage of that. And if you're not, well, then you'll see why you get so many great benefits. And it's finally here, man. I know this whole week kind of dragged on. We had nights with only one game, and it was still kind of like play in, quasi playoffs, Greg. But finally, with 4 juicy games today, we can say the postseason has begun.
Yeah, and I mean, so I think a technicality here. So this is technically the playoffs, but I still consider the play-in game to be the postseason because it was still after the season, correct? So we could still call that. But it was something in between. But I very much enjoyed the games. Were you pro or anti the play-in tournament?
I was pro the Western Conference. I was anti the Eastern Conference. Eastern Conference just felt like it, with Charlotte and then again with Indiana, if you were down early, that was it. Wave the white flag, start looking at tee times. The Western Conference, look, right through last night. I mean, double overtime. Even if you were against the whole principle of the play-in opportunity, and you're right, on the postseason, how can anybody deny the level of entertainment that we got simply from that one game, knowing, of course, that there's still technically a playoff berth on the line. So yeah, I thought that was definitely worth my time invested for sure. And I'm sure the ratings are going to go through the roof. So even if you hate it, you're just going to turn into one of these old men yelling at a cloud, right?
Yeah, and the games were good, right? So the other thing that I was thinking about too when I was thinking about the games is we got games that felt like they mattered that didn't really matter. That Warriors team was no good. People wanted to see Steph Curry in the playoffs. We got to see him play two really entertaining games against the Lakers and then a great game that went to overtime last night against the Grizzlies. I don't really have that much doubt in my mind they would have just gotten wrecked by the Jazz in the first round of the playoffs, most likely in 4 games. So to me, those 2 games we got were probably more entertaining than the 4 games we would have gotten against Utah anyway. And it was extra basketball. So I was for it, and I thought they were fun.
Yeah, we get caught up in the play-in games in the tournament, right? And we know that 16 seed is just going to get massacred by Kentucky, fill in the blank, Duke, whoever it may be, normally on up years, right? So Gonzaga. And we still kind of get excited. But this, I agree, was that times 10 because you had quality players out there. So now we kind of turn the page, if you will. And a reminder here, especially for the live before lock shows, you want to make sure that you've hit that notification bell on top of liking and subscribing, because you don't want to miss these shows as we bring you right up to that 2:00 Eastern lock. So is there a new mentality? Is there a different Greg Ehrenberg mentality now when you approach the postseason, knowing, of course, playoffs now, knowing, of course, that the slates are normally going to be a little shorter and you may not focus so much on cost and you may not focus so much even on ownership when you're looking, especially on a slate like today?
Yeah, so the biggest difference for me, at least when I'm running through players and projecting them, is we could safely assume everybody's going to play bigger minutes than they did in the regular season. So, well, maybe not with the Bucks. We could talk about that in a second too, because the Bucks playoff rotations were a total mess last year. And I think the number was actually the combination last year of Chris Middleton, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and Eric Bledsoe, I think played a total of 3 fourth-quarter minutes together in last year's series against the Miami Heat. So Budenholzer was very odd with the way he ran his rotations, and I tend to think that's not going to be the case this year. But that aside, in general, I think we look at a lot of these guys and we just assume really big, significant minutes. So it was something we saw in the play-in tournament, for example, although Jonas Valanciunas got into foul trouble in yesterday's game. In general, he was somebody who we saw was a really good pointsman and fantasy producer in the regular season, but would often play, 25, 26 minutes. And then we got into the play-in tournament, and when it was competitive games, he was playing as many minutes as he could handle. So there's a lot of guys like that now that I feel, pretty safe projecting to play bigger minutes they did in the regular season. And that also kind of limits the amount of value options we have because we no longer have bench players that, close to min price that we could expect to play, 25 to 30 minutes anymore.
Yeah, as we start to look at positions, just quickly before that, on that same vein, I imagine Brooklyn now becomes an interesting case study overall because the expectation normally may be, hey, you got 3 guys, you have a long trek deep into the playoffs. Maybe you extend the bench just a little bit in this opening round against Boston. But the reality is we haven't seen these guys play much at all. And if there's ever an opportunity to tune up the big 3, it would be against Boston in the first round.
Yeah, and that to me is one of the situations that's hardest to project, not from a minute standpoint, but from a usage standpoint, because we only saw these guys play a few games together over the course of the regular season. I'm going to pull up the numbers when all 3 of them shared the court this year as I'm talking.
It wasn't much, though.
No, it wasn't much. And then the other thing, too, is, these guys are all such high usage players, and we saw them play together in such a limited amount this year that it makes it really hard to know, hey, what are these guys' usage rates and what does their overall production look like when they share the court together? So I have it up now. So in total, Durant, Harden, and Kyrie, the 3 of them played together a total of 202 minutes during the regular season. So that's a very, very limited sample size. And in those minutes, we saw Kyrie had a 23.5% usage rate. Harden, shockingly, only an 18.4% usage rate. And then Kevin Durant led the trio with a 29.4% usage rate. But I don't know how much weight to put into that, given that it's, still a really small sample size, and who knows what the dynamic looks like changing heading into the playoffs. That and also a lot of those minutes were when Harden first came over and was first getting acclimated. That's why the usage rate is so low. So to me, I don't have a mass amount of exposure to any of them. I don't feel comfortable with that, but I don't feel comfortable getting to a ton of them either, just because I think there's a chance that all 3 of them are pretty good, but not great from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, and looking at knowing that you can run him point guard, shooting guard slots, right, on DraftKings at 10-3. Luka's going to be the only one higher than him. as far as a point guard slot for James Harden. But I would think, and just looking at the unknown for the big three, especially as you lay out the concerns you have from usage rate first trickling down to minutes, I would think James Harden, especially at that price, and again, we're not talking about price overall in this gigantic slate, Greg, but more so just in comparison to Luka, if you're going to pay up, or even Dame, who's just below him, it seems like the unknown would drive you to stay away from him, even in smaller percentage of lineups.
Yeah, so I'm not off him entirely. It's just that I mean, you look at the price point at first glance, 10,300 on DraftKings. On FanDuel, he is 10,500. You just think that's a great price point for James Harden. And then I kind of ran through some of these numbers, and you project him out, and you look at the numbers when all three of them are on the court, and it's hard for me to project him for significantly more than 50 fantasy points because, like I said, he only had an 18.4% usage rate when Irving, Harden, and Durant, all three of them shared the court. And for sure, all three of them aren't going to be on the court together at the exact same time for the entire game. So these guys are going to see usage rate increases when one or two of them are off the court. Maybe there's some minutes where Harden's the lone star on the court. But either way, there are other guys I prefer to pay up for. So I have just a limited amount of exposure to Harden today.
I see the chat buzzing on some lesser priced guys for the point guard position. But before we get to that, with Fournier, Smart, Hero, I see a couple of those chats kind of repurposing those names. Looking at who you are paying up for, Luka right there at the top. We know speaking of the unknown, I mean, that's the polar opposite, right? You know exactly what you're going to get. And I wonder at 9,400 on DraftKings, if you start to look at Damian Lillard as a pivot for Luka in some lineups.
Well, for one, in terms of a pivot, like I'm not massively high on Luka either, even though I'm pretty confident in his minutes. My preferred pay up options are Jokic and Giannis today. And then something else to point, because you had brought up ownership percentage, and which, by the way, is free today on Awesemo.com. But if you look at the ownership for this slate, there is nobody that projects as massive chalk. We have nobody projected for over 30% ownership, and that is Kawhi Leonard right at the flat 30% number. Beyond that, at the top end, you know, these guys are pretty even. We have Jokic, 23% projected ownership. Giannis, 19% projected ownership. Luka, 16%. Harden, 16%. So all that considered, I think you just go out and you roster whichever guy it is you have the most confidence in, because there isn't really a massive ownership gap between these guys. To me, the one that I am most confident in individually is Nikola Jokic, who going up against Portland Trailblazers, it's a game that we are expecting to be played pretty tightly, only a 1-point spread. They're also a 226.5 total. So that's pretty decent looking. It's among the higher end for the slate. There's only one game, Dallas and the Clippers, which has a significantly lower total than the other four. But I mean, Jokic, he's going to be the MVP. I think the only question is he going to be unanimous or not unanimous at this point? And he had a really good fantasy season. And now, especially over the last few weeks where there's been no Jamal Murray in the lineup, the usage has been really high for Jokic. The minutes were really high. So I expect him to play somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 minutes. And given the points per minute production we saw from him this year, he's the guy that I'm overall most confident in.
Yeah, as 10-6, I'm looking at it on DraftKings, so clearly he's going to be up there at the top, but we're not even, I don't even think, in a position, right, Greg, to be arguing with anybody about overpaying for a guy like that on the return, especially the matchup where against Nurkic, only 23, you mentioned nobody chalk, Kawhi and a couple of guys ahead of Jokic there. Why, in your opinion, do you think that he's only at 23% owned so far? Looking at a couple of other guys, clearly the price tag may jump out to some people, but when we're talking about an immediate return, I don't see where there's any risk at all with Jokic.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I definitely think amongst the high-end guys, he's the safest. There's no real blowout risk. There's no real concern with him sharing the ball with anybody. Like the Nets situation, I think all three of Harden, Durant, and Kyrie present different risks because maybe it's a big Harden game, maybe it's a big Kyrie game, maybe it's a big Durant game. I think there's a bunch of guys the ball could end up going to. There is none of that real concern with Jokic. So if the Nuggets are going to stay competitive, we have to stand to reason it's because Jokic plays really well. As for your other question about why the ownership is so flat, it's because there's no obvious value on this slate. Basically, every other slate we've played over the last 2-3 months has been sometime leading up to lock. We've had a handful of core players that get ruled out. And all of a sudden, it just opens up all these obvious plays in like the 3,000, 4,000 range. We'll all of a sudden project for, 30 fantasy points or something like that. And everybody rushes to rush them. And for good reason. It's the playoffs now. Nobody's ruled out. We have fully healthy rosters pretty much across the board. So with that in mind, there's no obvious pricing value to go to that would drive up anybody's ownership.
And you mentioned available now, free tool today, the NBA main slate ownership projections, all of that available for Awesemo plus the entire community. And I'm seeing this, you want to talk about in the thousands as we continue to remind you about this, including everything today that you're going to hear, this ever-growing community here on the Awesemo platform. And I'm told, Greg, that we are just 40 subs away from that clean number of 55,000, which is humongous at that point. So
I'm not impressed. Should be higher. Should be higher. We should be getting more likes, more subscribers. Everybody's listening should like and subscribe right now. And there's no reason we shouldn't be at 70,000. And then the moon, right? That's where everything on the internet goes to. It goes to the moon. That's where we're going next.
Exactly right. And we can pay off better than any of those cryptos that are supposedly already there. Here's the thing about that. I laid it out for you so that you could drop the gauntlet. So we know that we're 40 away from 55K. I'm getting from you that by the end of the show and in 40 plus minutes that we have here, we should be at what, 56, maybe 57K? Forget 55K.
For sure. And then the other thing too is this should also be the most watched video in the history of YouTube, right? Like, I mean, what are we competing with? It's probably like a couple of Justin Bieber songs, the guy who saw a couple of rainbows. Listen, this is right up here. This is better content than any of that.
Well, yeah, don't forget somebody redoing like a Doja Cat song on their piano or in their guitar or something like that, like a Nirvana cover that gets a million likes. You might have to do something crazy. I was asked if I can do an Eric impersonation on the show. It wasn't even with you. So you may have to break something crazy out. Maybe one of these Spags proclamations, right? Like if we get 1,000 likes, I don't know what you would get, but I'll support you wholeheartedly. If you want to get a tattoo, I'll pay for it. How about that?
So here's what I'll do. Unlike what anybody, because everybody on our YouTube channel, like, oh, I'm gonna shave my eyebrows. I'm gonna whatever. I'll get your name tattooed on my ass. Here's what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna give out genuine fantasy basketball information. Like I think that's something that's not utilized enough in the overall DFS community.
You're just going to pay back the community with what you're here to provide. And that's insight. There's not going to be any extra. I like it. You know, it's a movie with a plot as opposed to all the glamour and glitz and explosions. It's smart and it's a throwback. I love it. And now Soul Dope on the super chat, Soul Dope 1234. And we continue to encourage you as we lead you tonight. We lead you today to the 2:00 Eastern lock, first game of 4. So questions that you have from Greg, especially on the super chat and the premium Slack, we want to keep a big eye on. Do you have cheaper Fanduel point guard plays that you like? I saw earlier a couple of people asking about Marcus Smart. Maybe there is somebody that you've looked down as far as paying up that we talked about earlier. Maybe there is somebody that you've looked down a little bit on that list and are at least comfortable with that number.
I think there's so many good options to pay up for at point guard. Like you absolutely have to go cheap. I think Reggie Jackson makes a little bit of sense. You go to Goran Dragic just based on the role he played in the playoffs last year. Maybe you could talk yourself into saying that he's going to play a little bit more minutes in the playoffs, based on how they handled him in the past. But I mean, still, it's a pretty loaded backcourt for the Miami Heat. I still think Kendrick Nunn's going to play minutes and Tyler Hero's going to play significant minutes. So I generally think that point guard is a position you want to pay up for, particularly on FanDuel. But if you absolutely need to go cheap with somebody, the one that I have projected the best in the cheap range is Reggie Jackson. So that would be the option, but still overall to me, he's a fairly weak play.
As far as looking at how strong Jokic is and how much exposure you have in your lineups, you mentioned that you weren't huge on Luka, and maybe as I thought and others may think that you would be, and clearly staying away from the big three from Harden and Irving, especially in the backcourt. But what about Giannis as far as the high price return, especially in comparison to Jokic?
Yeah, so I like Giannis a lot. My two favorite pay-up options on the slate, number one is Jokic, number 2 is Giannis. I also have to add in that a lot of these plays are vastly different on DraftKings they are on FanDuel. So to me, Luka Doncic is a much better FanDuel play than he is a DraftKings play, because DraftKings there's a lot more positional flexibility, and then more often than not, we're just kind of comparing guys and how many points we think they're going to score. And I have Giannis project for more fantasy points than Luka. I have Jokic project for more fantasy points than Luka. I have Harden project for more fantasy points than Luka. But then when you start to look at FanDuel, it's a little different because Luka is just kind of in the same price tier as Kyrie, Damian Lillard, and himself. And those are really the expensive point guard options. So to me, I think Luka becomes a stronger play on FanDuel than he is on DraftKings. But that aside, your question about Giannis, I think this is a really good spot for him. I mentioned at the top that I was a little concerned potentially about his minutes this year just because of how wonky Budenholzer's rotations were in the playoffs last year, where, I mean, we did ultimately end up seeing Giannis get hurt in that series last year against Miami, except even before then in the playoffs, he wasn't playing his core guys that many minutes, but we did see a little bit of a shift. Number one, towards the end of that series, Chris Middleton played 40 minutes when they actually were in situations where they needed to win. And that was something that Budenholzer had said all throughout the playoffs last year was, hey, if I have to play my star players 40 minutes to win a playoff game, then we don't deserve to win games in the playoffs, which I think was kind of a ridiculous stance to take, especially because that's what other teams do. And that's, it's the easiest way to improve your team in the playoffs is you play your best guys more minutes, but that's generally been a philosophy that he hasn't subscribed to. But if you look at the regular season and some of the minutes that Giannis played in marquee matchups, we, fairly regularly would see him play minutes 36, 37, 38. So I don't know if he's going to do that every single game in the playoffs, but I think that in the opening series here against Miami, a matchup that they lost last year, I feel pretty confident about Giannis's minutes, at least more so than I did last year. So with that in mind, Giannis, great pointsman and fantasy producer. I still prefer Jokic to him, but Giannis is my second overall favorite pay-up option.
Yeah, and again, this goes back to the point you made, but as people are continuing to come in, as we get you ready, about just under 40 minutes now from the 2 o'clock game locking in, the slate locking in overall, not the obvious value on the board. So that's going to factor into why a guy like Jokic, for example, isn't more owned. And you look at Giannis, and I wonder if, well, that's part of it, Greg, but also these narratives. And you could just see it on the chat, right? Oh, the Heat own the Bucks and they own Giannis. And you mentioned the injury last year. I think flying under the radar this year with the Sixers and even Brooklyn ahead of them, it just feels like this is going to be a different matchup, even from a betting standpoint. So I'm with you where I don't think that there's enough history to bank on fading Giannis, especially if you can already, as you justify the number associated with him as far as cost, and then you start to look at below 20% for ownership. This may work in your favor even more so because of how many people may be fading him simply because of the narratives.
Yeah, and then something else I'm curious about is I'll ask people who do you expect to win the series? Are people just generally outright picking the Miami Heat to win? I mean, the Bucks are still favored in the series, and people are saying like, hey, look how bad Giannis was in the playoffs last year. Was Giannis that bad in the playoffs last year? I mean, don't forget, he got hurt in that series against Miami. The game before he got hurt, he still scored over 60 fantasy points. If you look at his game logs from last year, in the series against Miami, he did have that game. He finished with 60 fantasy points. Against Orlando, he scored at least 57 fantasy points in every single game in that series. He scored 64 more in 3 of them. So, I mean, the idea that Giannis just sucks in the playoffs, I don't totally buy into that. He got hurt last year, and it was, by the way, also a series that the Bucks severely underperformed in. It was definitely one that I expect them to win going in. I didn't give the Heat much of a chance to win. Obviously, they did end up winning, and I assume that a lot of people now, based on some of the reactions we're getting, that, we've got Miami. Well, maybe a little bias here. Miami Mike saying Heat in 6. King Dash, Heat be shutting Giannis down.
I want to see the screenshots of the betting slip of that, all right? Because otherwise it doesn't count when you're coming out with such a ridiculous... Look, it's one thing if it's both minus 110 across the board. When you're taking a dog like that in this series, I'm sorry, Greg, I need to see betting slips before I take that seriously.
Yeah, and by the way, Miami Mike, you didn't have to go and delete your message you put in chat. I was just pointing out that there's a chance that somebody whose name is Miami Mike might be a little, for whatever reason, a little lean towards the Miami Heat. But yeah, it does seem, at least based on me throwing out the question right here, I think we immediately got like 9 answers, and they were all people picking the Miami Heat to win. So.
Yeah, but that's just to get under your skin. You know that. They're not really picking the Heat to win.
I don't know. I think there's a lot of people that are picking the Heat to win. Like, I mean,
really?
Is anybody – I think so. Is anybody picking the – I mean, I'm sure there are people who are picking the Bucks to win too, but
yeah.
I think
I don't know if I'm going to lay the 5.5 today. And, of course, everything comes on OddsShopper, oddshopper.awesemo.com. As far as game 1 is concerned, but I'm with you as far as the initial, which I took as more of a rhetorical question, where this whole thing started with Giannis and you throwing out there, are you really picking the Heat to win and not just like, I go through these pick'ems on an office pool every year and I just have to try and get ahead of everybody else who's doing chalk. I mean, like legit from a basketball standpoint, I don't see how Miami can knock the Bucks off in a 7-game series.
Yeah, I mean, of course they can. I just don't think it's the most likely scenario. But getting back to Giannis's ownership, I think that's something that's maybe driving it a little bit. We have Giannis projected for 22% ownership on FanDuel, sub 20% ownership on DraftKings. So, I mean, just the overall arching question that we had asked going into this is, why is the ownership kind of split amongst these guys? Well, number one, there's a lot of stars. But then number two, I think a lot of biases are coming into play where a lot of people are like, well, Giannis sucks in the playoffs, I'm not going to roster him. But he performed fairly well in the playoffs last year other than getting injured.
Our Kathleza on the super chat, a couple of super chats to get to here, Greg. Thoughts on Forbes at 3K on DK, as he says he thinks they'll need him to play at least 20 minutes against Miami. Giannis will need shooters around him.
Yeah, so I don't totally agree that they need to play Forbes 20 minutes. I think he's going to be in the rotation. I think I gave him 12 minutes. I'll pull it up really quick, but I gave him 14 minutes I gave to Bryn Forbes. But it's not like he's a great points per minute fantasy producer. I still think Pat Connaughton's going to play decent minutes. And, it's not like Drew Holiday and Chris Middleton are bad shooters. So they're certainly shooting around Giannis. And for the season, Bryn Forbes played 19 minutes per game and only averaged 14.47 DraftKings points. So if I'm assuming that he plays under that 19 minutes, then, I mean, think about it. We're only expecting him to score somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 13 fantasy points. And that's most likely not going to be enough to be optimal. I think there are a few cheap plays that are viable on the slate. Nobody who stands out as like a crazy good value play, but Bryn Forbes is not one of the guys I'm getting to. There are other cheap guard options. I mentioned Reggie Jackson a little bit before. He's somebody I prefer. Patrick Beverley, I think if you really want to take a shot on somebody who we could potentially see his minutes extended a little bit in the playoffs, I think he's somebody else for cheap at guard who I prefer to Bryn Forbes. So there's a few guys there, nobody who I feel massively confident in, but Bryn Forbes not my player pool.
Orion on the super chat, and this kind of opens up the conversation for the two, especially guys that you can roster as a 1-2 or 2-3 for today's slate. Greg, favorite FanDuel shooting guards, knowing that it's a big field GPP, and you've mentioned this across the board, how it's not just position, it's just the slate itself. There's no overwhelming value that people are siding with.
Yeah, so overall, my favorite shooting guard on FanDuel is Marcus Smart at 5,700. I know that he was not good in the last game, the play-in game against the Washington Wizards, but still he played 35 minutes. There's no Jaylen Brown in the rotation for the playoffs, so that's going to It's going to boost his playing time and minutes a little bit going forward. And then also it's a positive matchup against the Nets. As good as the Nets are on offense, their defense stinks. And I think there's a chance that all of these games between the Nets and the Celtics, even if the series only lasts 4 games, which I think is probably most likely, I think all of them are going to be fairly high scoring. The total of that game bears that out also. So Marcus Smart's going to be playing a lot of minutes. And as long as he stays out of foul trouble, guarding the likes of Kyrie Irving and James Harden, I think he's a little bit underpriced. If you look at his price for most of the regular season, he's somebody who we normally would expect to be priced somewhere in that 6,000 range. He's a little bit under that right now. And I think it's reasonable to expect he's going to play more minutes in the postseason.
And we saw Fournier mentioned on the chat a couple of times. So I imagine simply because they're going to be the same price in this game, that's pretty much answering the question of if you had the two, or do you have exposure with both?
So it's, I mean, are we still talking about FanDuel? Because that's going to be
no, I'm
different.
sorry, DraftKings. I apologize. Okay. That's my fault.
So for FanDuel, it's totally different just because they're different positions and different prices. Overall, though, I have Marcus Smart projected for more fantasy points. So he is my preferred option of the two. But on DraftKings, I don't think either of them are priorities. But on FanDuel, Marcus Smart is a very high priority play.
Looking at the position and kind of looking around, we just talking about that Bucks Heat game and the obvious, maybe not so much for others with Giannis and looking at it from a Milwaukee standpoint. What about Tyler Hero in this spot? Do you have much exposure in this game for anybody on Miami? I know Jimmy Butler would probably be the more obvious one, especially when you look at how high owned he is. But when you look at the slate itself, how much are you playing Tyler Hero?
None. I get that he played well in the playoffs last year, but I mean, there were some outrageous Tyler Hero takes before the season. Remember when James Harden was on the trade block and Heat fans were like, hey, we can't trade Tyler Hero for James Harden. Apparently that was a sticking point in the trade too, is that the main reason the Heat didn't end up landing James Harden is because they didn't want to part with Tyler Hero. But the issue with him coming down the stretch of the season now is they have Trevor Ariza on the roster now. That's somebody else who's taking up wing minutes. And he's still kind of buried on the depth chart behind other guys. So Kendrick Nunn is ahead of Tyler Hero in the rotation right now. Goran Dragic, I think there's a good chance he plays more minutes than Tyler Hero in the rotation. So if Hero was priced, way down for the playoffs, then, maybe I could see getting to him. But or else I think anybody who's playing him is just trying to capture the magic of what happened in last year's postseason. And the Heat have, a lot of guards to get to this year. And also don't forget that some of those games where Tyler Hero went off, Goran Dragic was hurt. Remember, Goran Dragic had that foot injury. He missed a bunch of time. Then even when he played, he was severely limited. So to me, I don't think this is a good spot to go to Tyler Hero at all. And then one other thing, sorry to mention before we go on, Kendrick Nunn was also totally out of the Heat's rotation during most of the playoffs last year. Now he's a starter for them.
We'll continue this on playoff narratives, kind of what we were hitting on with Giannis, because there's another guy that is highly valued and the boom bust all the way through ownership and predictions out west with the Clippers. And reminder here is we have for you today, the main slate ownership rankings projections are there for you free on the Awesemo Plus platform. But this is an awesome opportunity, speaking of which, to remind you just what you get. And even if you're only looking to play NBA DFS, well, then you can take the $29.95 weekly Awesemo Plus package, which really is just easy and simple and gives you access to everything that we have here. And then also more and continued opportunities to join the Awesemo Plus Platinum category. But with today, just NBA DFS, don't worry about it. We can streamline that for you. $16.95 for the weekly package, or the weekly express package, which is just $4.95, and you get access to stuff and you don't have to wait one day a week for it to become free. You can just roll and you can follow along with Greg as he's breaking down his rosters, exposure, and where we have it. So just looking at, and there are really two kind of double plays, if you will, that I'm curious about how much exposure you have with lineups. And Portland is one of them, but let's start with the Clippers, please, because you have both Kawhi and Paul George right there at the top from an ownership standpoint. And I imagine that a lot of that is just because when you look at them, especially on DraftKings, 8,000, 8,400 Leonard, and pardon me, 7,800 Leonard, George, respectively. So looking at these two guys individually, Greg, and then collectively, how much are you rolling with them? And then how many lineups do you have where both Kawhi and George are out there, mainly because you can squeeze them in from a number?
Let's see. I definitely have a handful of lineups with both of them. I don't have an issue with it just because of what their price is. Neither of them are priced correctly for the playoffs. And I think some of that is just because of the way the Clippers finished the season. We see this with the pricing algorithm all the time, particularly on DraftKings, where if somebody misses a handful of games or maybe plays limited minutes, the price just gets nerfed. So we've seen that over the last couple weeks of the season where the Clippers, I wouldn't say outright tanking, but they were definitely trying to avoid being on the same side of the bracket as the Los Angeles Lakers.
Yep.
So we saw Kawhi and Paul George sit towards the end of the season. And even when they did play, the last couple of games we saw Kawhi in action, he played 31 and 30 minutes. That was after resting against the Rockets and the Thunder. Then Paul George, his minutes, pulling that up, he rested those two games of the games before he played 34 and 33 minutes. So with that in mind, we've seen both of them priced down way too much on DraftKings, especially for the playoffs, because now those minutes, as long as this game's competitive, which I'm expecting all the games to be competitive today, we're probably going to see Kawhi Leonard and Paul George both play in the neighborhood of 36 minutes. I have both of them projected for around 45 fantasy points, and that makes them two of the better value plays on the slate. So they are both popular, but I don't think they're popular enough. We have Kawhi, like you said before, the most popular play on the slate right now, coming at 30% ownership. Paul George, 28% ownership. I think both those numbers should be higher. These guys are both really strong plays.
Yeah, and it's amazing how this anti-playoff narrative is working against, or at least in some capacity, working against Giannis. But of all people, it's not at all, it looks like, working against Paul George.
Yeah, Paul George, I'm going to pull up his playoff numbers now. They're not as bad as people think they are.
Yes, and that's why I use the term narrative, right? Because it's always built off of something small. It's like the schoolyard. I mean, social media, all it takes is a couple of tweets, a hashtag of playoff P, and next thing you know, he's the worst postseason player in the history of NBA basketball, Greg.
Yeah, so, I mean, for sure, that shot against the Nuggets was awful last year, the one that hit off the side of the backboard. And then also he generally sucked down the stretch of that series. But, I mean, we forget about it because it was a long time ago. But, he single-handedly kept the Pacers in playoff series against LeBron James and the Cavaliers, and he was really strong during those stretches. And Paul George is still one of the best players overall in the NBA. I think there was actually a point last year, even when he was struggling, his playoff numbers are very similar to Damian Lillard's. And from an efficiency standpoint, from a three-point shooting perspective. And it's funny when you think about it in terms of the narratives about these guys, where Dame is thought of, hey, it's Dame time. This is one of the clutchest players in the NBA. Whereas Paul George is like, this is the biggest choke artist the league has ever seen. And then you compare their numbers together. And now, because of the way Paul George finished last season, the true shooting percentage for their careers in the playoffs does lean a little bit towards Damian Lillard. But it's not like there's some massive gap between the two, at least definitely not what the narrative indicates. So maybe that's something that would prevent some people from playing Paul George, but I don't care about it.
Lowest total, as you mentioned, on the board. Everything else is probably, or right now, just looking at OddsShopper, the other three are pretty much in that same area, 227 to 231.5. And I don't think that necessarily the total itself impacts how people may look at the Clippers, but I do wonder if just the prediction outside of what we know Luka can bring, and you mentioned that you weren't as high as maybe other people would be on Luka, where else on Dallas, just looking at that team, can you find some good value to get return on scoring?
All right. So somebody who's a massively different play on FanDuel versus DraftKings. Kristaps Porzingis is over 8K on DK, but he's only 6,900 on FanDuel. So you consider the price point and then also the positionality, where Porzingis also, he scores better on FanDuel anyway because of the defensive stats. To me, I think that he's overall one of the strongest power forward options. I think him and Giannis are the two top plays at the position. Whereas on DraftKings, he's somebody I don't really have interest in. So this is one of the spots. And also Luka, there's also, I said he's a better play on FanDuel than he is on DraftKings. There's a few guys on the slate, and them being two of them, who are just massively different plays across the two different sites.
So just putting you on the spot here, are there other names that are of note that we should be talking about with that level of discrepancy? Because maybe somebody doesn't look at it enough at the other app. Maybe somebody's just looking at it from one, especially if it's the site where it's a deterrent and staying away as a whole.
So it's hard to say that anybody is just an outright fade on a 4-game slate, like somebody like, unless it's somebody, like a Tyler Hero, right. Just because I think that'll be something that gets under people's skin a little bit. Now
you redlined him from the show about 5 minutes ago. So
yeah. So let's now ensue. Tyler Hero goes out and shoots, like 9 of 10 from the field in 23 minutes. But beyond that,
risk.
Yeah. The key ones to me are definitely the Clippers guys. Marcus Smart, mentioned him before. He's a significantly different play on FanDuel versus DraftKings. It's more than anything having to do with some of the positionality, and then also where some of the pricing is. Michael Porter Jr., somebody I don't have interest in on DraftKings, but a lot of interest in on FanDuel, where he's 7,500. We have to roster 2 small forwards. So those are the handful of players I think are the most different between the two sites.
Looking at it, just because I saw his name pop up on the chat a little bit earlier, and when you just look at some of the kind of from top down with the boom bust that we have here on Awesemo, and looking at where we stand from guys that are 50+% or higher, and there are only 4 of them. By the time you get down, and Bam is somebody that we should talk about just as far as the expectation, especially at that center spot, how much you are rostering him. But you just mentioned Michael Porter Jr. fading him more so than not. You start to get down to Norman Powell as the guy that's not a 1 or 2. I mean, arguably Kemba Walker now with Jaylen Brown out. That's not an obvious 1 or 2. So I'm just curious where you have Norman Powell across the board for 2s and 3s, or maybe just kind of rostering him in different spots depending on the lineup.
All right. So I just look up what my ownership is for Norman
Perfect.
Powell. So he's somebody also who actually is a stronger play on DraftKings than he is on FanDuel. Norman Powell, 6,400 on FanDuel, and then Norman Powell on DraftKings is priced pretty differently. He's at 5,700, so we have a $700 price difference. So he is a stronger play on DK, but I'm still only getting around 10% of Norman Powell. I'm not exactly sure how significant his upside is. So he's been really consistently kind of putting up the same fantasy point totals since coming over to Portland, and definitely over the last couple weeks with everybody healthy. So they've played, let's see, in their last 8 games, in 6 of them, Norman Powell has scored in between 24 and 27 DraftKings points. So on a site like this, sure, if you get, 27 DraftKings points from somebody at 5,700, it's probably not going to kill you, but it's not going to win you a tournament either. So a lot of these guys that I look at. And I think what he's probably most similar to is, if anybody was watching yesterday, how I talked about somebody like Kevon Looney, where Looney is very consistently scoring right around the neighborhood of, like 20, 22 DraftKings points, basically every game he plays. It's not going to kill you, except the odds of somebody like that landing in the optimal lineup isn't very likely. So if Powell's one of the last guys into a tournament lineup for you, if you're building it by hand, fine, no issue with that. But going out of your way to target him, I think that's a little bit of a mistake, because I don't think he has the upside to win a tournament.
Low ballers on the stream, by the way, catching your back here, Greg. All the Miami lovers. And I'm looking at this on OddsShopper.awesemo.com, where we go for everything up to date, your best bets across the board. And the best you can get, the Miami Heat, plus 188. That's not even enough value to take the risk on the Heat, man. Just more and more emphasis on this Giannis play, and more emphasis on destroying that narrative. I love it.
Yeah, and by the way, also, I just noticed we have some questions in the premium Slack chat, which we could hit on also. But yeah, I think the spread could definitely stand to be a little bit wider in that. I'd be curious. I don't know off the top of my head. I wonder what the spread was for game 1 of Bucks Heat last year. Because the other thing to keep in mind too is that there's home court advantage this year also, right? There was no game played in Milwaukee in the bubble last year because it was all in Orlando. So I think Orlando was Milwaukee was probably something like an 8.5 point favorite or something like that in game 1 against the Heat. So, I mean, what happened last year is getting pretty heavily priced into this line today.
Yeah, and that's a trap to me. And I know we'll get back and look at some things and specifically on the premium Slack here for you. But that's a trap to me. That's luring people in to believe that this is going to be a closer game because of all the things that have happened. It was the bubble. And that's the perfect way to encapsulate what happened last year. Home court advantage. Everything changes. Hell, I need it here in Philly. Home court advantage. Nikola on the premium Slack. And a reminder here, the Awesemo Plus package, $29.95 a week. You can be part of the premium community here and hit Greg and others up right away. I see Greg all over the chat, even when he's not on the air. I see you popping in all over the place. That's an accurate depiction of you and how you spend your time, correct?
No, I don't watch anybody else's shows when I'm not on.
I'm saying the premium Slack, I see you popping in when you get tagged.
Oh yeah, that I answer questions.
Yes.
And the YouTube chat though, no, I'm not listening. I'm not tuning in to see like Eric say who the chalk plays of the day are. I hope he's listening right now. But no, I don't need to see like Spags, like what he's done with his hair for the day. I don't need Eric to tell everybody who the chalk is. But Slack, I'm definitely answering questions.
And let me just say this in case they are listening, Spags and Eric, that was not me setting Greg up. That was me actually asking about the premium Slack. So let's look at Nikola. Any advice on uniques today on the FD 150 max entry in that tournament, that contest?
So I'm trying to think like what exactly he means by this question.
So are we looking at maybe lower cost? I mean, could you look at for example, centers, right? We talked about a bunch at the top there with Jokic and even Giannis if you wanted to roster him there. But what about the difference between a guy like Bam versus a cheaper pivot in Brook Lopez?
I mean, Brook Lopez to me is a pretty weak play today. It's not like he's priced down that much either. He's all the way up at 5,100 on FanDuel, somebody I don't have in my player pool. The other thing, too, is like I don't think you need to worry too much about ownership today. It's pretty flat, although we did just get an ownership update, and there are some significant changes. Anybody could see that if they go check out the ownership. It's free today on Awesemo.com. But, I mean, Marcus Smart is picking up over 35% ownership on FanDuel, but it's not like there's any stone-cold chalk play. It's like, oh, my God, this guy's going to be, 50 or 60% owned. I think you could, for the most part, play the guys you think are the best players today if maybe you want to try to make rules in Fantasy Cruncher to maybe try to pair some of the stars from the same games. Like maybe you really like Jokic, so you try to make it a point to make a group where you try to get some more of Jokic and Damian Lillard together, and you hope for maybe a shootout between the two of them. So that's a way to add some correlation to lineups. But overall, I mean, there isn't a way on FanDuel I look at and be like, hey, there's some guy you need to avoid or come way underweight to the field on based on ownership.
All right, let's look at, we've got a couple of things here. Another premium Slack question, and it's more of a big picture one for you that you hit on right at the top as far as leaving salary on the table, not really mattering, using your entire salary, kind of looking at the cost, and also get back to the super chat. But real quick, just to update that, as you mentioned, this is massive as Paul Millsap is now in the lead at 43% owned. People continue to stock up on Paul George, and then Butler has taken over Kawhi Leonard as well. So before we get back to the chat and the premium Slack, Greg, what are your initial reactions seeing that drastic change in ownership, at the very least with Paul Millsap now, 43% owned, 3,600 I see on DraftKings.
Yeah, that's a lot of ownership going to Paul Millsap, and I liked him as a value play, and I still do. But yeah, that's a very aggressive move for him. I think before he was like 18% projected ownership or something. Now he's all the way up to 43. So I do think that in the playoffs, he's probably likely to see more minutes than did in the regular season. But seeing what that ownership is, let me see. What is Aaron Gordon at? Actually, all of these guys from Denver are now really popular. So we have Paul Millsap, 43% projected ownership. Aaron Gordon, 24.8. Michael Green, 24.6. So my initial thought was going to be like, hey, try to pivot to one of the other forwards from Denver who's maybe picking up less ownership. But we don't really have that kind of option. So to me, I'd say have Paul Millsap in the player pool. He's in my player pool, but I'm not going to get him. I'm not going to get to 43% of him, I don't think.
Well, those guys at least start scoring. It's going to have to pound the over on Jokic assists today for sure. On the premium chat, you don't know JD. Greg wants to know your opinion here. Last small forward in a single entry Fanduel, Harris, Robinson, or Richardson?
Let's see who I have projected for the most fantasy points. And it is, so I assume Joe Harris, Duncan Robinson, and Josh Richardson. That would be Joe Harris by a bit of a margin.
Not even close. Okay. I saw the super chat, but it looks like it was retracted. So don't worry. We're not, going to bite by any means. Greg can tell you with me, there's nothing like a stupid question or anything along those lines. So we'll hit what we can for you. But yeah, that ownership change, looking at the game now, as we got lineups locked in for the 2:00, we're about 12, just under 12 minutes away here. And a reminder to smash it. We want you to subscribe, hit that 55K and beyond. I think we had the gauntlet thrown down today in the next 11 and a half minutes to be at 58,000 subscribers by the show end, according to Greg, at least. And I'm right there with him, backing him here. But Jimmy Butler was a name that kind of was talked about in reference to other people in this game. How much are you rolling with him? 8,400 on DraftKings. So not as high as a Lillard or even 10,000, a 10K or plus. Where is Jimmy Butler along the lines of your exposure in your lineups, Greg, knowing that, as we see, continuing to be higher and higher owned?
Yeah, I still think he's a strong option, particularly if you're playing cash games for today. I actually think Jimmy Butler is a must play in cash games. One thing that I think is really important here is the minutes. So Jimmy Butler, who his minutes were somewhat muted down the stretch of the regular season. If you look at over the last 2 weeks, Jimmy Butler only played 29 minutes per game. I'm expecting Jimmy Butler to play somewhere in the neighborhood of 38 to 40 minutes today. And given that his price is still, pretty reasonable, and that he was somebody who we saw priced, about $1,000 higher than this just about 6 weeks ago, I think that I think he's still somebody who's pretty strong to target. And with it being a little harder to find value on this slate, if you want to go with some of the cheaper star options, it is a lot more tenable to be able to fit, Jimmy Butler and Kawhi Leonard in the same lineups than it is to go and fit guys like Giannis and James Harden in the same lineups.
Just speaking of guys in the same lineup, how many lineups do you have or that you're looking at exposure with the Blazers backcourt and rolling with both CJ and Dame?
None. I don't always make rules in Fantasy Cruncher, but something I do a decent amount for Blazers games, if the prices are pretty expensive for CJ McCollum and Damian Lillard, is I do try to not put them in the same lineup because they are two of the more negatively correlated backcourt players in the league, especially the way that they score their fantasy points. They're both very scoring dependent, scoring heavy. They need the ball in their hands, and it's not like there's going to be other ways that Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum rack up fantasy points. There isn't all of a sudden going to be a game where it's like, oh, well, Damian Lillard had 12 rebounds and 3 steals, and it didn't matter that he didn't score. So generally, every bucket that Damian Lillard has is probably going to come away from CJ McCollum and vice versa. So those are two guys that I do try to make a point to not play together.
Is there anybody, just looking at this game as we're about 10 minutes in from everything locking up, I'm just curious, the first game itself and trying to sneak in, especially with the starting lineups, we didn't really talk enough about, or a lot about, I should say, Chris Middleton and where you have him in lineups. And we were also getting as far as uniques. I don't know if you're playing Middleton and at all so much, or especially with Giannis and kind of matching him up in this particular game against Miami, if something about Middleton jumps out in a positive standpoint.
Just because of positionality, he's a strong play on Fanduel at 7,300. I think he's one of the top small forward options. He's actually the small forward I have the second most exposure to on Fanduel, behind Jimmy Butler. On DraftKings, though, minimal to no interest in Chris Middleton, just because of where he's priced. And then also, I think it's just a higher priority to get to guys like Jimmy Butler or somebody like Kawhi Leonard, because Kawhi Leonard is $100 less expensive than Chris Middleton on DraftKings. Jimmy Butler's only $300 more expensive. Whereas if you compare the prices to these guys on FanDuel, Kawhi and Jimmy Butler both $1,500 more expensive than Middleton. So just because of the pricing differences, Middleton good play on FanDuel and not really on DK.
There was a question thrown out earlier, and it was just kind of in passing about Dragic versus DiVincenzo. We now know, as you mentioned, none. We get the lineups, big impact as far as what didn't happen last year. So none starting. And MJazz24 on the premium Slack, Greg, wants to know how you feel about Dragic now on FanDuel, that none is in the starting lineup.
Yeah, I mean, when we were talking a little bit about the Heat's rotation before, my expectation was always that Kendrick Nunn was going to start. And that's also one of the reasons when we were talking about Tyler Hero that I don't like Hero as much, is just because he has a lot of guys that he's competing for with minutes. So Kendrick Nunn is going to get minutes. Tyler Hero is going to get minutes. Goran Dragic is going to get minutes. Duncan Robinson is still going to get minutes on the wing also. So, I mean, you just factor all of these guys in. And to me, Dragic isn't somebody who I personally want to get to. I think that anybody who's playing people like Dragic or Hero, they're doing it based on what happened in last year's playoffs. It's not based on what the rotation has been during this regular season. And Kendrick Nunn, at least based on what we've seen from minutes over the last couple of months, he's going to play more minutes than either of those guys. And I don't think Nunn himself is a particularly strong play. So to me, the guys on the Heat that I want to get exposure to is primarily Jimmy Butler, a little bit of Bam Adebayo, but then these other guards are just kind of a no-go for me.
TRD, Richardson or Brunson on DraftKings?
Neither would be
That's fair.
would be the preferred option.
You have that right. I don't know if they've told you this, right?
Let's see what price range those guys are in. Maybe there's a better pivot that I prefer. There almost certainly is, because I can get exposure to either of those guys. So Brunson is priced at 4,100, and then Richardson's at 4,300. So I would rather get to. Oh, this is a crappy price range. Let's
4,300. I mean,
is there anybody who's cheaper?
Really.
Maybe. Yeah, 6 minutes left. Rebuild your entire lineup, dude.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to go. Now, really, I mean, at that point, it doesn't look at it, right?
I mean,
go to the Boston game.
I have Richardson projected for 1/10 more fantasy points. So if it has to be one of those guys, the slightest of lean toward Josh Richardson, but I don't have exposure to either of them.
No, and that's fair. And I was just looking to see if there would be anybody even cheaper, even at that 2 spot. And we talked about the unknown, especially how that's going to impact usage for Brooklyn. So even hurt, or without being hurt, I think you'd probably stay away from a guy like Landry Shamet. Now coming in questionable, fade hard, right?
And here we go. Actually, he amended his question. He said best guard play under 4,400.
So you have a little more room to work with.
So that's Reggie Jackson to me.
Okay.
And then, I mean, hopefully that salary you could, with the salary savings, you could spend up somewhere else. But Reggie Jackson's in my player pool. I think he's a good value play. I don't like Richardson or Brunson.
We'll get a lot more in the next 4 or 5 minutes here as we lead you right up until everything locks at 2:00. But we still have a ton of things happening here throughout the day on the Awesemo channel. UFC live before lock. We've got an MLB LBL as well. And then back in the NBA this evening with myself and Terry. So across the board, we have you jammed here, and you can't really be a part of it unless you're part of the Awesemo community, the Awesemo Plus community, right through the DFS packages that we have, including the NBA DFS and then the NBA Weekly Express package as well. And all of that gets you to the Awesemo Hall of Fame. And that's where you can download the Awesemo profile pick, awesemo.com/avatar. And all you need to do is place in the top 3 of any contest with over 5,000 contestants. Tweet us at Awesemo HOF, and you'll win a free month of Awesemo Plus Platinum. And I think we've seen a couple of at G Ehrenbergs up there, right?
Yeah, I like people do like to send pictures when they see me, but I'd prefer that don't do that.
Don't tag you on anything.
Nah, leave me be. Just come troll me. Nothing. I don't want no. I prefer limited positivity. I want people to troll me. I want people to ask me questions. I want people to tell me I suck. No niceties.
I tell you, man, you come down here working Philly any day with that mentality. It'd be fantastic. So there you have it. Again, you have to have the profile pick. That's what we continue to tell you. And just download that awesemo.com/avatar. If you're part of the Awesemo community, my goodness, you're probably up there. Look at that. Picks, memes, tag Greg, whatever you want to do. But just make sure you troll them. We don't want any, hey, thanks for your insight, Greg. It's, I faded you or whatever else the trolling comes in that. And you can't pass up a guy who's opening up the door for that. All right, some final thoughts here, just looking across the board. Is there anybody that may jump out from you, Greg, that's higher owned that turns into an auto fade or mostly fade? I mean, I'm looking at guys like Carmelo Anthony, I assume because of the price. 24, nearly 25% owned. Blake Griffin, another guy who I don't know how you can trust, even if he's playing minutes because of the enigma that is the big 3 in Brooklyn. Are there guys that are low cost but high owned that you simply just don't like?
Duncan Robinson, the ownership makes very little sense to me. Maybe this is also a thing where people saw he had some of those big shooting games in the playoffs last year, and people are trying to jump on Duncan Robinson, but this goes back to, and everything just keeps circling back to the Heat, especially because we've had a lot of people, say that they're picking the Heat outright to win. They're talking about they want to roster Tyler Hero. They want to roster Goran Dragic. Well, Duncan Robinson right now in our latest ownership projections, we have him picking up 26.4% ownership. That's a massive number for him at 4,600, especially if you look at his overall games for the year. And also, I think Andre Iguodala, he's probably going to play a bigger role in the playoffs. I don't know how many more minutes there is for Duncan Robinson to play. In the regular season, he played 31.4 minutes per game. He averaged 23 Draftkings points. And let's see, when is the last time he really had significant upside? He had one game against the Mavericks where a bunch of guys were injured where he scored 40 fantasy points. But other than that, I mean, there just aren't very many big box score games from Duncan Robinson. So it's curious to me that the field is flocking to him in such a high number. I think that Duncan Robinson, he's a safe play. But he's somebody who I don't really have a lot of interest in, particularly that kind of ownership. That's pretty crazy to me.
Last one to work in here in the final minute. We mentioned Brook Lopez is a terrible pivot for Bam. Is there another pivot below Bam that you like at the center spot?
Let's see. Who are some of the centers?
Zubac, at 4,600.
Yeah, so Robert Williams is actually somebody who I like a whole bunch. So I'm assuming he's going to start again. He's projecting we got some ownership going to him 20% right now on DraftKings. On Fanduel, though, I think he was significantly lower than that last I looked. 16% ownership for Robert Williams. So he's been one of the better players on the Celtics this year. He's played really well on defense, points per minute, fantasy producer has been excellent. Just the one issue with Robert Williams has been the injury concerns. And last game he came in, he was questionable with a toe injury, ultimately ended up starting over Tristan Thompson. Got re-injured during the game, so maybe that's a little bit of a concern for people. But as long as Robert Williams starts, I think he's one of the better value plays on the slate. I currently have him projected for over 30 fantasy points. The only way that's going to change for me is if we ultimately end up finding out that Tristan Thompson is actually starting at center.
And just to be clear, you're fading Melo, right?
Well, that's a random question out of nowhere. Let me see.
Well, no, because I threw him in there with one of those guys that were super low cost but high owned. So I was just getting that because everybody on the stream started piling on Melo. So I figured we could end on a positive note where we're all collectively on the same vein.
I have 5% exposure to Carmelo, which screw that guy, right? Is that a good way to close? Screw Carmelo Anthony? All right, there we go.
We can't say it any better than you just heard Greg Ehrenberg say it. Screw that guy. Thank you all for being a part of another Live Before Lock. And guess what? You have another one coming up right now with Jason and Pete, UFC Live Before Lock at the top of this hour. So we have a lot of content from UFC to MLB, right back to NBA tonight. Keep it here. Thank you. Like, subscribe, share, notification bell. Tell everybody. You see somebody new in the community, remind them as well. Great stuff, Chris. Thank you, sir, producing the show. Greg, as always, my friend, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, see you, dude.
All right, everybody, thank you for watching, tuning in. Good luck.